She had 41 hours left. 41 hours before her 30th birthday ended, before a dead man's words written into legal stone handed everything she'd built, everything her grandfather had trusted her to protect, over to a man who would sell it for parts. 3 men had already run. So Victoria Hale, CEO of a $400 million foundation, the woman whose name appeared in Forbes before she turned 25, walked into a dusty furniture workshop on the edge of Savannah and said the most desperate words of her life. I need a husband, and I need one before tomorrow. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while, and it's worth every minute. The sawdust never fully settled in Liam Carter's workshop. It hung in the afternoon light like a slow-moving fog, drifting through the wide barn doors he kept propped open with a cinder block from April through October. The smell of it, cedar, lacquer, linseed oil, and something older underneath all of that, something like the inside of a church that hadn't been renovated since 1940, had soaked so deep into the walls and the floorboards, and probably into Liam himself, that he'd long since stopped noticing it. He noticed almost everything else, though. The way afternoon light hit the grain of a piece of black walnut at exactly the right angle and turned it from brown to something closer to gold. The way an old joint would sing when it finally seated properly, a tiny pop of wood against wood that meant the piece was whole again. The way his daughter Sophie's sneakers squeaked on the concrete floor when she came running in from the school bus, still wearing her backpack, because she never, not once in 7 years, remembered to take it off before she ran. He heard the bus now. 3:45 on the dot. He set down the block plane he'd been using on a battered secretary desk from roughly 1887, wiped his hands on the shop rag he kept tucked in his back pocket, and waited. The squeak of sneakers, the bang of the side door, the backpack hitting the floor approximately 1.5 seconds after Sophie decided she couldn't carry it another step. Dad. Soph. She appeared in the workshop doorway, 7 years old, hair escaping from a braid that had probably been neat at 7 this morning and had since staged a full rebellion. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, a little too serious for her age, and she was holding a piece of paper out in front of her like a warrant. Mrs. Bellamy says I have to write a report about a historical artifact. She said artifact the way children say words they've practiced. Carefully, proud of the syllables. What's an artifact? Something old that tells a story, Liam said. Sophie looked around the workshop with an expression that suggested she found this deeply unfair. Everything in here is an artifact. Exactly. She dropped into the old wooden stool she'd claimed as hers approximately 30 seconds after she was old enough to climb onto it, and she started pulling apart the braid herself, methodically, the way she approached most problems. Liam went back to the secretary desk. This was the rhythm of his days, and he'd made peace with it a long time ago. Work in the morning, pick up Sophie, or wait for the bus. Work a little more while she did homework nearby, or narrated whatever was happening in the book she was reading. Make dinner. Do bath time. Read to her until she fell asleep, sometimes before she did. Get up and do it again. It was a small life. He knew that, had known it since he and Claire sat down years ago, and agreed, half joking, both meaning it, that they wanted a small life. Good work, a good home, a kid or two eventually. Claire had been a school teacher. He'd already been doing restoration for 4 years. They weren't aiming for anything that required a publicist. Claire had been gone for 3 years. The grief had changed shape over time, which people told him it would, and which he hadn't entirely believed until it actually happened. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was more like scar tissue, present, sometimes stiff, occasionally surprising him by aching when he expected it not to. He kept going. Sophie kept going. They'd figured out how to be 2 instead of 3, and it had taken time, and it had been ugly, and some of it had happened right here in this workshop. Him crying into his shop rag at 2 in the morning because he didn't know where else to put it. But they were okay. He was genuinely okay. Which was why the sound of an unfamiliar car pulling up his gravel drive at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon was unusual enough to make him straighten up and listen. Not many people made the drive out here without calling first. His clients usually emailed. His neighbors knew to knock on the house door, not come around back. The friends he had in Savannah, a small group deliberately maintained, mostly texted. The car that pulled up was black. A sedan, expensive, the kind with a finish so polished it looked painted on with a brush. A driver got out first, walked around, and opened the back door with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing exactly that for years. The woman who stepped out looked like she'd been built by a committee assigned to create the concept of authority. Late 20s, maybe 30. Dark suit, not business casual, not even business formal, something beyond that. The kind of suit that had probably cost more than Liam's truck. Dark hair pulled back so precisely it looked architectural. She was carrying a leather document portfolio pressed under one arm, and she was already looking at his workshop with the focused assessment of someone who looked at everything and calculated it. She did not look at the gravel. She did not look at the state of his truck or the organized chaos of lumber stacked under the side overhang or the cinder block propping open his door. She looked directly at him. "Liam Carter," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," he said. "My name is Victoria Hale." She said it the way some people say their own name. Not with arrogance exactly, but with the weary certainty of someone who expects it to mean something and has stopped pretending otherwise. "I need to speak with you, privately, if possible." Liam looked at Sophie, who had stopped dismantling her braid and was now watching the woman with open curiosity and zero attempt to hide it. "She's 7, he said. "She's pretty good at keeping secrets." Something crossed the woman's face. Not quite a smile. More like the ghost of one, passing through. "It would be better privately." He nodded toward the house. "Sophie, give us 10 minutes." "Are you in trouble?" Sophie asked him, with the particular directness of a child who asks what adults are only thinking. "Don't think so. Go get a snack." Sophie looked at Victoria Hale once more. A long, thorough look that evaluated her the way children evaluate everything, fully and without pretense, and then grabbed her backpack and disappeared inside. Liam pulled the stool Sophie had vacated to a slightly better position and gestured toward it. "You can sit." Victoria looked at the stool, then she looked at the secretary desk he'd been working on, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, or something like it. "Is that an 1880s cylinder desk?" she said. He blinked. 1887. Secretary desk, not cylinder. "You know the difference?" "My grandfather collected Southern period furniture," she said. "I grew up around it." She set the leather portfolio down on his workbench with more care than she'd probably set most things down. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it completely before you respond. Can you do that?" "Depends on what it is." "Fair." She pressed her palms flat against the edge of the workbench and looked directly at him. "I have until midnight tomorrow to get married. If I'm not married by the time my 30th birthday ends, a legal clause in my grandfather's estate hands controlling interest of the Hale Heritage Foundation to my cousin Vincent. Vincent will dismantle the foundation within 6 months and sell the Southern Collection, a privately held archive of pre-Civil War documents, furniture, and material culture that has been kept intact for over 100 years, to private investors who will break it apart and scatter it across private collections around the world." Liam said nothing. He'd promised to listen. "I have tried 3 other men," she continued, and there was something in her voice when she said it, a flat, factual quality that told him this cost her something to admit. "One took money from Vincent to back out. One panicked when he understood the media attention involved. One—" she paused, very briefly. "One I simply misjudged." "And now you're in my workshop," Liam said. "And now I'm in your workshop." "How do you even know who I am?" "Your work," she said. "I've tracked your restorations for 3 years. You restored a Hepplewhite sideboard for a collector in Charleston 2 years ago that came out of an estate connected to my grandfather's original collection. Your work is impeccable. More than that—" She stopped, seemed to be choosing words. "You're not connected to anyone in my world. You have no financial exposure to anyone who could be leveraged against you. You have a daughter, which means you're not going to manufacture a scandal. And you have a reputation in this city as someone who is—" "What?" Liam said. "Honest." She said it simply, like it was a rare enough commodity to require specific sourcing. Liam crossed his arms and leaned back against his workbench. He looked at this woman, Victoria Hale. The name was vaguely familiar to him now. Foundation work, had seen it in the paper once or twice, and he tried to find the angle. Because there was always an angle when someone walked into your workshop and said things like, "I need a husband before tomorrow." "What does this actually look like?" he said. "Practically. A courthouse marriage tomorrow. I have everything arranged. License, efficient, paperwork. You would move in publicly. There would be media attention, significant and sustained. My cousin will immediately challenge the marriage's authenticity, which means lawyers, depositions, and roughly 3 to 6 months of sustained pressure before the legal situation resolves. She paused. I would compensate you substantially. How substantially? $2 million. Half before the ceremony, half when the legal challenge concludes. Liam looked at her for a long moment. And after? He said. After the legal challenge. Then what? Then it ends. An amicable separation. I have papers drafted for that as well. She picked up the leather portfolio and held it out. I've anticipated every question you might have. Financial disclosures, legal structure, exit agreements, privacy protections for your daughter. He didn't take the portfolio. You thought of everything, he said. I try to. You didn't think of one thing. She waited. Why would I do this, he said. Not the money. I mean, why would I take my daughter's life, her routine, her stability, everything she knows, and drop it into the middle of a media circus for 6 months? For money? Sophie's not... He stopped. Tried to say it right. She's not for sale. Neither is our life. Victoria Hale held his gaze. She did not flinch, but something shifted in her expression, something almost imperceptible, like a door closing quietly in a room somewhere behind her eyes. I understand, she said. She reached for the portfolio. Tell me about the collection, Liam said. She stopped. The Southern collection, he said. You said pre-Civil War documents and furniture. Tell me what's actually in it. She looked at him with something he couldn't quite read. Then she set the portfolio down again. The core of it is a private archive assembled by my great-great-grandfather beginning in 1871, she said. He was a freedman, born into slavery in 1849 in coastal Georgia. After the war, he spent the next 40 years traveling through Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama, collecting physical evidence of that period. Plantation ledgers, letters, furniture built by enslaved craftsmen, land records, personal objects. Things people were throwing away or trying to forget. He believed if no one preserved it, the history would be revised into something easier. Liam was very quiet. The collection includes original furniture pieces, she continued, and her voice had changed slightly. The boardroom precision was still there, but something else had entered it, something that sounded like actual weight. Built by enslaved craftsmen whose names we know because he recorded them, documented, attributed, preserved. If Vincent sells to private collectors, those attributions get lost. The furniture becomes decorative. The names disappear again. Liam thought about the secretary desk behind him. 1887. He knew who'd sold it and who'd bought it and approximately what rooms it had passed through. He didn't know who'd built it. That gap, that specific absence, was something he thought about more than he'd ever said out loud to anyone. Who else knows about the collection, he said. Scholars, preservationists, a small number of institutions that have tried to acquire pieces over the years and been refused. She paused. It is the most significant private collection of its kind in the country. There is no equivalent. And your cousin wants to sell it. He wants the money. The collection is irrelevant to him. Liam uncrossed his arms. He looked out through the barn doors at the late afternoon light across the yard, the way the shadows were starting to stretch toward the house. Somewhere inside, Sophie was probably eating crackers and reading and wondering what was happening out here. He thought about what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. He knew that particular shape of loss better than he wanted to. I have one condition, he said. Victoria Hale went very still. You're not a guest, he said. If you're coming into this house, you're part of the house. Sophie asks you questions. You answer them honestly. We eat dinner together. You don't disappear into your phone every time it gets too real. He looked at her directly. I don't care about the money. I care about what my daughter sees modeled in her own home. If you can do that, then I'll be in that courthouse tomorrow morning. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were very still on the workbench. I can try, she said carefully. Good enough, Liam said. Sophie met Victoria properly at dinner that night. Liam had made pasta, nothing elaborate, the kind of Tuesday pasta that existed because it was Tuesday, and pasta was fast, and Sophie would eat it without complaint. Victoria sat at the kitchen table that was slightly too small for 3 people, and looked at it like she was being presented with evidence at a trial. You can eat it, Sophie told her helpfully. I know, Victoria said. You're looking at it funny. I eat alone a lot, Victoria said. I'm not used to tables that have other people at them. Sophie considered this with the solemnity it apparently deserved. We have dinner together every night, she said. Dad says that's a rule. It's not really a rule, Liam said from the stove. It's more of a... It's a rule, Sophie said firmly. Victoria glanced at Liam. He shrugged and set a bowl of pasta in front of each of them. Are you really going to marry my dad? Sophie asked. Liam sat down. Soph, it's okay, Victoria said. She looked at the 7-year-old directly, which Liam noticed. She didn't deflect to him, didn't soften the question back into something easier. Yes, we're going to the courthouse tomorrow. Is it because you love him? Sophie, Liam started. It's okay, Victoria said again. And this time there was something careful in it, something that was trying to be honest without being unkind. It's because we want to help each other. That's usually something that takes more time. Sophie thought about this. She twirled pasta on her fork with the focused attention she gave most things. My friend Carla's parents love each other, but they also yell a lot, she said. My dad doesn't yell. I noticed that, Victoria said. Are you going to sleep here tonight? Sophie, Liam said. What? I'm asking. Yes, Victoria said. Your dad said there's a spare room. It has a weird lamp, Sophie said. The shade is crooked. Dad keeps meaning to fix it. I keep meaning to fix it, Liam confirmed. Sophie looked at Victoria seriously. You probably shouldn't touch things in the workshop without asking. He doesn't say anything, but he has a face. Victoria looked at Liam. A face? I don't have a face. You have a face, Sophie said. Victoria almost smiled. It was close. Closer than anything she'd managed since she'd walked in from that black car. It didn't quite make it, but it was close. After dinner, Sophie showed Victoria the spare room with the proprietorial air of someone who has been the only woman in a house for a long time and has opinions about guests. The lampshade was, in fact, crooked. Victoria straightened it with 2 fingers, absently, while Sophie explained that the 3rd drawer of the dresser stuck, and you had to pull it at an angle. You know this room pretty well, Victoria said. I sleep in here sometimes, Sophie said. When I have bad dreams, I like it better than my room because it's closer to Dad's. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Victoria said, about whatever you've been through that made you need that. Sophie looked up at her. Mom died, she said. Matter of fact. The way children say hard things sometimes, because they've said it enough times that they've learned to carry it without crumpling. 3 years ago, it was her heart. A pause. Do you have a mom? Not anymore, Victoria said. Not for a long time. Sophie nodded slowly. Then, with the pragmatic efficiency of a child who has learned not to sit inside sad things too long, she said, There are extra blankets in the closet. Dad likes it cold at night. He'll probably turn down the heat. I'll remember that. Okay. Sophie moved toward the door, then stopped. Victoria? Yeah? The lamp looks better, Sophie said, and disappeared down the hall. Victoria stood in the spare room for a moment after she left. The overhead light was too bright. The dresser was slightly water-stained at the top corner. There was a framed print of a botanical illustration on the wall that looked like it had come from a yard sale and been hung with care anyway. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her phone. 14 missed calls from her legal team. 2 from her PR manager. 1 from a number she didn't recognize that she was fairly certain was a journalist. She put the phone face down on the nightstand. Through the wall, she could hear Liam and Sophie going through what was apparently a nightly routine. Sophie's voice, high and insistent about something. Liam's lower, patient. Something that might have been arguing about whether teeth brushing needed to happen before or after the chapter they were reading. Sophie was losing, but losing with dignity. Victoria lay back on the bed without taking her shoes off. She stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she was getting married. The thought should have been terrifying. In some clinical part of her, it was. But underneath that, underneath the legal calculus and the strategic necessity, and the 3 years of planning that had somehow still resulted in this particular emergency, was something smaller and harder to categorize. The kitchen table had had other people at it. She fell asleep before she meant to. She didn't move until 5 in the morning, when she heard Liam's alarm go off through the wall and the soft thud of his feet hitting the floor. The Chatham County Courthouse opened at 8. They were there at 7:53, and the small parking lot was already starting to fill with people who had nothing to do with them. People with their own paperwork, their own legal necessities, their own reasons to be standing outside a government building before the working day officially began. Nobody recognized Victoria at 7:53. By 8:15, someone did. Liam was watching her sign a form at the clerk's window when he heard the change in the noise level behind him. Not loud, just a different quality to the ambient sound of a public space, the specific murmur that meant phones were coming out. He glanced back. A woman near the door was looking at Victoria, then at her phone, then at Victoria again. Next to her, a young man was already texting. "Someone recognized you," Liam said quietly. Victoria signed the last line without looking up. "I know. We have maybe 15 minutes before it circulates enough to matter." "Does that bother you?" "Constantly." She capped the pen. "But not today." The ceremony was in a small room off the main clerk's area, performed by a justice of the peace named Gerald, who had been doing this for, based on the energy he brought to it, approximately 9,000 years. He was kind in the way that people who have witnessed an enormous amount of human crisis in small rooms tend to be kind, efficiently, without fanfare, like kindness was simply the default setting and required no particular effort. Victoria had arranged the two witnesses, her attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Christine Kwan, who looked like she'd been awake since 4 a.m. because she had been, and a man named Marcus who worked for the foundation and who shook Liam's hand with a grip that communicated both. "I am not sure about this, and I will absolutely not say that out loud." There were no flowers, no music. Sophie was at school because Liam and Victoria had agreed the night before that this particular morning was not something a 7-year-old needed to be part of. Gerald read the words. They stood side by side and said what Gerald told them to say. When he got to "You May Kiss the Bride," there was a moment, very short, maybe 2 seconds, where Liam and Victoria looked at each other and had what appeared to be an entire conversation without any of it happening out loud. Then Victoria leaned forward slightly, and he did the same, and it was brief and careful, the kind of thing that existed primarily to satisfy the official requirement. Christine Kwan notarized everything within approximately 90 seconds of its completion. "Congratulations," Gerald said, with the warmth of a man who meant it even for people who were clearly doing this for reasons that were not straightforwardly romantic. "Thank you, Gerald," Victoria said. Outside, on the courthouse steps, they discovered that 15 minutes had been optimistic. There were 4 photographers. 3 of them were professionals, the kind who appeared at things like this with equipment that cost more than Liam's truck, and with the practiced reflexes of people who made their living getting the shot before the subject knew it was happening. The 4th was a teenager with a phone who was clearly just in the right place at the right time and would probably post it before they got to the car. Victoria walked through the cameras with the practiced steadiness of someone who had done this many times. Her hand was in the crook of Liam's arm. Christine had advised it. Optics, it's about optics, and she moved without flinching. Liam moved without flinching too, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected to feel more exposed, more conscious of the cameras. Instead, he felt oddly focused. He was aware of the photographers, aware of Victoria's hand on his arm, aware of the weight of what had just happened in that small room with Gerald. But he felt, strangely, like himself. The black sedan was at the curb. The driver, same man, same practiced efficiency, held the door. Victoria stopped before getting in and turned to him. "There'll be more of that," she said. "I gathered. A lot more." "Okay." She looked at him like she was waiting for something to crack, for the reality to land and for him to start reconsidering. He could see it, the way she was braced, like she'd seen the other 3 do exactly that and was waiting for it to happen again. "I'm going to pick Sophie up from school at 3:15, he said. "What time should I expect you tonight?" Something in Victoria's posture shifted, infinitesimally, like something she'd been holding released itself. "By 7, she said. "Dinner's at 6:30, he said, "but I'll save you a plate." He walked to his truck. Behind him, he heard Christine Kwan's voice, urgent and low. "We need to talk about the statement. The board is already—" And then the car door closing. He sat in his truck for a moment before starting the engine. His hands were on the steering wheel, and he looked at his own wedding ring, still there, the one he'd stopped being able to take off when he tried 3 months after Claire died because it felt like an act of erasure. He'd kept it on. Habit, grief, necessity. He should have thought about that this morning. He hadn't thought about that this morning. He started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot, and he didn't let himself sit in that too long because Sophie had science today, and she'd been nervous about the lab, and he'd promised to ask her about it. And dinner needed planning, and that was what today was. That was what today was going to be. He pulled onto the road heading home, and the radio came on. Some old country station he'd never gotten around to programming out. And he turned it up and drove. The first 10 days were a specific kind of difficult that Liam hadn't anticipated. Not difficult between him and Victoria exactly. More like difficult in the way that having another person in a space calibrated for two slightly mismatched people is always difficult. The adjustments, small and constant. The learning of another person's gravity. Victoria woke up early. He'd known that from day one. She was in the kitchen by 5:30 most mornings, standing at the counter with coffee and her phone, moving through what looked like 70 unread messages with the focused efficiency of someone who had been managing information overload for a decade and had made peace with it. She didn't intrude on his pre-dawn hour in the workshop. He didn't intrude on whatever she was doing in the kitchen. But she learned by the fourth morning that he made a second pot of coffee at 6. And she started coming to the workshop doorway at 6:15, mug in hand, to look at whatever he was working on. She didn't say much. She didn't ask questions designed to demonstrate interest. She just looked with that same focused assessment she'd walked in with on day one, and occasionally said something that told him she actually knew what she was seeing. Dovetail joints, she said on the 5th morning, looking at a lowboy he was reassembling. Hand cut, he said. Someone knew what they were doing. When? Late 1800s, probably 1890s, based on the secondary wood. Yellow pine. Southern Peace. Georgia, I think, based on where the estate sale was. She looked at it for a long time. My grandfather would have wanted this. He didn't say anything, neither did she. They both stood there in the early morning light, and the silence was not uncomfortable. Sophie, for her part, adapted to Victoria's presence with the pragmatic flexibility of a child who has already processed significant upheaval and developed, from that processing, a kind of resilient openness to new arrangements. She didn't pretend Victoria was her mother. She didn't treat her like a guest either. She treated her with the specific attention of a child who is trying to figure out a new thing and is going to take the time to do it properly. She asked Victoria questions constantly. About the foundation, about what she'd been like at Sophie's age, about whether she liked animals, about what her favorite food was, about why she always wore her hair up. Victoria answered every question with a directness that seemed slightly uncomfortable at first, like she was used to deflecting personal questions, even from 7-year-olds, but which, over days, became less stiff and more natural. The media, meanwhile, was conducting its own investigation. The photographs from the courthouse steps ran in 3 separate outlets by that evening. 2 characterized the marriage as a calculated power play by Victoria to secure her position against her cousin's legal challenge. 1, a gossip-leaning site Liam had never heard of, ran a photo of him walking to his truck with the headline, "Billionaire Heiress's Mystery, Husband. Who is the Savannah craftsman?" He found that one because Sophie found it first. "Dad," she said, holding up her school tablet with an expression that oscillated between troubled and intensely curious. "You're on the internet." "I know. It says mystery husband." "I'm aware." "Are you a mystery?" "I'm not that mysterious." "It says you're a craftsman." She tried the word. "Is that the same as what you do?" "More or less." She looked at the article again. "They don't know about me," she said. "No." "Should they?" "No," he said. She nodded slowly, filed it away with the seriousness of a child who understands more than adults typically assume. "Okay," she said, and went back to her homework. Victoria managed the media from her phone with a precision that was almost mechanical. Statements released through Christine Kwan, no direct interviews, a level of availability to the press that was calculated to communicate stability without providing material. She was good at it, the kind of good that came from years of practice. But there was a specific morning, the 9th day, when the calculation showed its seams. He came out of the workshop at lunch and found her sitting on the back porch steps, phone in hand, not doing anything with it, just holding it. She was looking at the yard, his irregular, imperfect yard with the raised garden bed Sophie had insisted on, that had so far produced 4 tomatoes and a great deal of ambition. And her expression was not the composed, managed one she wore for phone calls and public appearances. She looked exhausted. "There's a journalist outside the workshop," she said without turning around. Has been for an hour. I've been trying to decide whether to address it directly or let Christine handle it. Let Christine handle it, Liam said. If I let Christine handle everything, she's your lawyer. That's what she's for. Victoria looked down at her phone. Vincent released a statement this morning. He's claiming the marriage is fraudulent, that we don't cohabitate, that there's no established relationship, that the marriage was executed for purely financial reasons connected to the estate clause. Is any of that legally actionable? It's the basis for the challenge he's building. If he can establish that the marriage lacks the elements of an authentic relationship. She stopped. We live in the same house, Liam said. That alone isn't sufficient. We eat dinner together. Liam, Sophie told him she likes his workshop. Sophie's voice came through the screen door. A pause. Sorry, I wasn't eavesdropping. I was getting water. A slightly longer pause. She does like it, Liam said. Victoria looked at the garden bed with its 4 tomatoes and enormous ambition, and something passed across her face that was not armor and was not the managed expression. Something that looked for a second like it might be close to undone. I'm not used to this, she said. Which part? Any of it. She stood, smoothing the front of her jacket with the automatic gesture of someone putting their public face back on. I should call Christine. Eat lunch first, he said. She stopped. There's soup, he said. Sophie made it. Badly. But it's soup. Victoria Hale, CEO of the Hale Heritage Foundation, stood on the back porch of a modest Savannah house on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at the man who was technically her husband. Does she actually make soup? She asked. She opened the can, he said, and she stirred it, with the wrong spoon, but still. The corner of Victoria's mouth moved. This time it made it. Small. Barely there. But it made it. Okay, she said. They went inside for soup. By the end of the 3rd week, a routine had assembled itself around them the way routines do. Not planned, not agreed upon, but present one day in a form that made it clear it had been building quietly for some time. Victoria started helping Sophie with homework most evenings. Not because anyone asked her to, but because Sophie, with her gift for simply incorporating people into her orbit and expecting them to participate, had one night slid a reading comprehension worksheet across the table toward Victoria and said, What does formidable mean? Impressive in a frightening way, Victoria said. Sophie thought about this. Like a lion? Like a lion, yes. Or like you, Sophie said with perfect 7-year-old candor and went back to the worksheet. Liam, from the kitchen, said nothing. But Victoria glanced at him, and he kept his eyes on the cutting board, and the careful set of his jaw told her that he was trying not to smile. The thing about living in Liam Carter's house was that it was imperfect in every direction. The 3rd step of the staircase creaked loudly enough to announce anyone who used it after 9 p.m., which was apparently a long-standing feature Sophie had leveraged extensively until Liam figured out the timing of it. The kitchen faucet ran cold for approximately 45 seconds before the hot water arrived, a fact Liam had clearly calibrated his entire relationship with the sink around without ever thinking about it. The living room had a single overhead light that was, objectively, in the wrong position and a collection of lamps that covered the deficit with varying degrees of success. There were photographs on the walls. Not many. A few. Sophie at various ages, the most recent clearly taken last summer somewhere with a lot of trees and a creek. A landscape, not a print, an actual painting, small and simple, that Victoria stopped in front of one afternoon and stood looking at for a while. My wife, Liam said from behind her. He was carrying laundry past. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most hard things. She painted it about a year before. He stopped. She liked the low country. We used to drive out to the coast before Sophie was born. Victoria looked at the painting. Marsh grass and gray water, and a sky that was neither fully overcast nor fully clear. Some specific moment captured that was inherently passing, inherently impermanent. She was good, Victoria said. Yeah, Liam said, and kept walking with the laundry. She didn't push. He didn't offer more, and the painting stayed on the wall where it had always been, and somehow that felt right. The painting being there, the past being present in the house, without being hidden or performed. Victoria had been in spaces her whole life that had been deliberately composed, she realized. Her office, her apartment, her grandfather's house where she'd spent summers. All of them curated, presented, maintained as versions of themselves, rather than simply as themselves. This house was just itself. dented and dusty at the edges and slightly inefficient in its plumbing, and real in the way that things are real when no one has tried to make them look like anything in particular. She caught herself, one morning in the third week, standing at the kitchen sink watching the backyard while the faucet ran cold. Watching Sophie through the window, who had found a stick of some kind and was doing something with it that appeared to involve an elaborate imaginary battle. The early light came through the pecan tree at the back fence and made the whole yard look temporary and beautiful in that way that early light does, like it's showing you something that won't hold. Victoria stood there until the water ran hot. Then she made coffee and stood at the counter and went through her email with the careful focus she always brought to it. But something was sitting differently in her chest than it had been sitting before. She didn't name it yet. She was in some ways not ready to name it yet. The legal pressure was intensifying. Vincent's team had filed the formal challenge 2 weeks in, and Christine had spent the majority of the past week in depositions and document production. The board had received the filing, and, while they hadn't formally commented, at least 3 board members had reached out to Victoria's office with the kind of careful, neutral language that indicated they were watching and reserving judgment. Vincent himself had appeared on a business news program the previous week. Victoria had watched the clip twice, alone, in the spare room that had become, quietly, her room. I was smooth. He was always smooth. Vincent Hale at 40 had the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life knowing he was in a room because of his name, and had learned over time to make that look like merit. He'd said all the right things. Concerns about the foundation's governance. Concerns about recent decisions. Concerns, weighted carefully, loaded with implication, about whether the current leadership had the personal stability to manage an institution of such cultural significance. Personal stability. Victoria had closed the laptop. She knew what Vincent was doing. She had always known what Vincent was doing. He'd been doing some version of it since they were children, and their grandfather had made clear, without using the words, that she was the one he saw as the continuation of his work. Vincent had never forgiven her for that, or the old man for choosing, and the past 20 years had been the slow, careful execution of a plan to take by legal means what he couldn't take by inheritance. What she hadn't fully anticipated was how much more visible the fight became when you were trying to defend not just your position, but your marriage, but your home, but the life of a 7-year-old girl who didn't ask to be adjacent to any of this. She mentioned this to Liam one evening, late after Sophie was in bed, after the particular winding down of the house that she'd come to understand as its overnight settling in. Sophie's name hasn't appeared anywhere, she said. They were in the kitchen, the overhead light too bright as always, the comfortable aftermath of dishes done. Christine has been careful, but Vincent's people are thorough. If they start looking at her, they won't find anything useful, Liam said. He was at the table turning a small piece of wood over in his hands, something he did when he was thinking, she'd noticed. Sophie's 7. She doesn't have a digital footprint worth mentioning. Vincent doesn't need a digital footprint. He needs a narrative. Widower with young daughter. Wife uses child for authenticity. That's the story. He doesn't have to prove it. He just has to circulate it. Liam put down the piece of wood and looked at her. Is that what you think? He said. That you're using us for authenticity? I think it's what he'll say. That's not what I asked. Victoria looked at the table. The kitchen table with its slight wobble on one corner that Liam had shoved a folded piece of cardstock under and never properly fixed. The table where Sophie did homework and they had dinner every night. No, she said. That's not what I think. Liam nodded once, picked the piece of wood back up. Then let him say it, he said. It won't be the truth. And people generally... He paused. Well, sometimes they figure that out. That's optimistic. I'm a carpenter, he said. We're optimistic by definition. We spend a lot of time trying to fix things that other people gave up on. Victoria looked at him. He wasn't looking back. He was looking at the piece of wood, turning it over in his hands, and there was something in his face, not quite at peace, not untouched by anything, but settled in a way that she didn't fully understand and wasn't sure she'd ever been. Why did you agree to this? She said. Actually, not the answer you gave me in the workshop, the real one. Liam was quiet for a moment. The craftsmen, he said. The ones your great-great-grandfather documented. The ones who built the furniture. She waited. I've been restoring furniture my whole career, he said. And one of the things that bothers me, that has always bothered me, is the attribution. Who made it? Usually we don't know. The piece survives, the maker doesn't. The work outlasts the name, and then the name is just gone. He turned the wood over one more time and set it down. The idea that there's a collection somewhere that kept both, that someone did the work of recording the names, and that collection could be broken apart, and the names could get lost again. He shook his head. I couldn't sit with that. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. My great-great-grandfather's name was Samuel, she said. Samuel Hale. He was 17 when the war ended. He walked most of the way from the Georgia coast to Savannah before he had shoes. I know, Liam said. I looked him up. After you left the workshop that first day. Victoria looked at him. He sounds, Liam said carefully, like someone worth the trouble. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She looked at the kitchen table, the wobbling corner, the cardstock shim that was never going to be a proper fix, and she felt something move in her chest that she had been carefully, competently, professionally not feeling for quite some time. She stood up and took her mug to the sink. Good night, Liam, she said. Night, Victoria. She climbed the stairs, third step creaking, announcing her as always, and went to the room that was hers now, with the lamp that no longer had a crooked shade, and she sat on the bed and looked at her phone for a long time without opening it. Outside, she could hear the low country sounds that never fully went quiet in Savannah, something alive and persistent in the trees, the occasional distant traffic, the particular silence that wasn't silence at all, but 1,000 small things continuing. She put her phone on the nightstand face down. She lay down. And sometime between that moment and the morning, without deciding to, she stopped feeling like a guest in someone else's life and started feeling something she had no ready word for. Not quite at home. Not yet. But something that had the shape of the possibility. The fourth week arrived the way difficult things sometimes do. Not with a single dramatic event, but with an accumulation of small pressures that built quietly until the whole structure was visibly strained. Vincent's legal team had been thorough. Victoria had expected thorough. What she hadn't fully expected was the specific texture of their thoroughness, the way they had combed through the margins of her life and found, in those margins, all the evidence of a woman who had been, for a very long time, fundamentally alone. Christine Kwan laid it out on a Tuesday morning, sitting at Victoria's foundation office on the 6th floor of a restored building in Savannah's historic district, the kind of office that looked warm and inhabited from across the room and felt, up close, like a stage set. There were no personal photographs on the desk. The bookshelves were organized by subject, not by the accumulated disorder of a life actually lived among books. The single plant in the corner was artificial, a fact Christine noted with the kind of professional neutrality that made it feel like a verdict. Their argument, Christine said, spreading documents across the desk with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for 22 years, centers on pattern of life, not the marriage itself. They're not challenging the legality of the license or the ceremony. They're going to argue that the relationship between you and Mr. Carter lacks the substance of a genuine marital union. They have surveillance from the first 10 days. 10 days of what? Victoria said. Separate schedules. Separate vehicles. No documented shared activities outside the residence. Christine paused. They have photographs of you arriving at this office at 7 a.m. on the morning after the wedding. Victoria said nothing. They also have a statement from a former associate of yours. I won't name them yet. We're still identifying the source, claiming that you discussed the arranged nature of the marriage prior to its execution. That's not possible. The only people who... Victoria stopped, ran the short list, felt something cold settle in her chest. Marcus. Christine's expression confirmed it without confirming it. I can't say that with certainty. How was the witness? He was there. Victoria stood and moved to the window. Below, Savannah's streets were doing what they always did, moving through the particular amber light of a southern city that had learned over centuries to exist in a heat that would break most places. He's been with the foundation for 8 years. Vincent's people have resources. How much? Enough, Christine said. The statement is limited. It doesn't have specifics that would be legally damaging, but in a hearing in front of the board, it creates doubt. Combined with the pattern of life evidence, they can build a narrative of a relationship that exists only on paper. She picked up the last document. The formal board hearing is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Victoria stood at this window and looked at the street below and felt the specific weight of a problem she had not fully solved pressing down on the back of her neck. She had been managing. She had been doing what she knew how to do, compartmentalizing, strategizing, keeping the foundation running during the day and coming home to Liam's house in the evening, and telling herself the separation between those two things was orderly and sustainable. She had not been wrong, exactly. She had been incomplete. I need to change how I'm moving, she said. Yes, Christine said. What they can document matters. It's all they have. Document everything that counters the narrative. Shared time, consistent presence, authentic, or at minimum, appearing authentic, daily life. Christine put the documents in their folder. I want to be clear with you, Victoria. I'm not telling you to perform something. I'm telling you that what they're documenting is an absence. The absence is real. Victoria turned from the window. I know, she said. She drove home that afternoon rather than having the car service take her. She needed the 20 minutes of driving through the city without someone else present. She needed the particular small privacy of being alone in a moving vehicle, which was, she had come to realize, one of the last forms of genuine privacy available to someone in her position. The absence is real. She turned Christine's words over the whole drive home. The problem wasn't that she and Liam were performing. The problem was that she had brought her operational habits, the managed distance, the careful compartmentalization, the deliberate separation of work self from home self, into a situation that required something different. She'd been treating Liam's house the way she treated everything, as a system to navigate efficiently without leaving too much of herself in it. And the surveillance photographs showed exactly that. She pulled up the gravel drive at 5:30, earlier than usual. Liam's truck was there. The workshop doors were open. She could hear something, a tool of some kind, rhythmic. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she got out, walked past the house door she usually went through, and walked around to the workshop instead. Liam was at the central workbench, using a card scraper on a flatboard that was going to be eventually the top of something. The motion was slow and controlled, the long strokes of someone who had done this enough times to make it look unhurried. He didn't stop when she walked in, but he registered her arrival. A slight adjustment of awareness, the way you adjust when someone enters a room, even when you don't look up. You're early, he said. I know. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. The sawdust smell settled around her immediately. She'd stopped noticing it sometime around day 10. I need to talk to you about something. He set the scraper down and turned to face her. She told him about Christine's meeting, all of it. The surveillance, the former associate, the pattern of life argument, the board hearing in 3 weeks. She told it factually, in the same ordered way she delivered information in board meetings, because that was how her brain organized things when it was under pressure, and she wasn't entirely sure how else to do it. Liam listened without interrupting. He leaned back against the workbench with his arms crossed, not defensively, just holding himself, the way some people do when they're taking in something that requires holding. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What did they photograph? He said. Specifically, me leaving for the office at 7 a.m. the day after the wedding, arriving back at 7 p.m. No interaction documented outside the house. Which is just true, he said. Which is just true, she agreed. He nodded slowly. What do you need? I need us to be less, she searched for the right word. Less parallel. I've been treating this like two separate things that happen to occupy the same address. That's what the photos show. That's what their argument is built on. Liam looked at her. You know I'm not going to perform something, he said. It wasn't combative, it was just clear. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Victoria put her hands in her jacket pockets, a gesture she rarely made because it looked, she'd been told once, too casual for someone in her position. She made it now anyway. I don't know, she said honestly. I think I'm asking you to let me actually be here, instead of managing from inside the house the same way I'd manage from outside it. Liam looked at her for a long moment. You can come to the workshop any time, he said. You've always been allowed in here. I know, She looked around the space, the tools organized on the wall with the particular logic of someone who knew exactly which hand reached for which thing. The pieces in various stages of restoration, each with a yellow sticky note attached indicating status. The smell. I didn't want to intrude. Victoria. He waited until she looked at him. You live here. She understood, hearing it said plainly like that this was the thing she had not quite managed to believe. Not in the operational sense. She knew she lived here, she slept here. Her clothes were in the dresser with the sticky drawer. In some other sense, The sense in which a place becomes yours because you've allowed yourself to exist in it without managing your own existence. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. He picked up the card scraper and went back to the board, and she pulled the shop stool to a position a few feet away and sat on it, and they stayed there for an hour. Him working, her not doing anything in particular that needed doing. And it was awkward at first, the specific awkwardness of learning to be present somewhere, and then it wasn't. Sophie came in at 4:15, backpack hitting the floor at the threshold, and stopped dead at the sight of Victoria on the stool. "You're in the workshop," she said. "Apparently," Victoria said. Sophie looked at her father. He shrugged. Sophie's face resolved into something that was unmistakably pleased. "Okay," she said, with the tone of someone confirming a satisfying development. She dropped down to sit cross-legged on the floor, with her homework spread out in front of her, and the workshop returned to its rhythm with one additional body in it, and that was that. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It didn't resolve anything structurally. But something in the shape of the afternoon was different, and Victoria felt it the way you feel a change in pressure. Not with drama, but with the body's quiet acknowledgement that something has changed. The weeks that followed built on that afternoon in ways that were not linear and not always comfortable. She learned that Liam's workshop was, underneath its apparent order, full of half-solved problems and deferred decisions. Pieces that had been sitting for months waiting for a part to arrive. A small French provincial side table that he'd stripped and then put down when something more urgent came in and hadn't picked back up. A drawer that he'd rebuilt incorrectly on the first attempt and was avoiding on the second. She found this unexpectedly reassuring. That the competence she'd observed in him was real, but not seamless. That his work had the same friction that all work had. She mentioned it one evening. "The Pembroke table," she said. "The one in the corner. How long has it been there?" He made a face. 4 months. "What's wrong with it?" "The rule joint." He glanced at it with the expression of someone who has been avoiding eye contact with a problem. "It's a hinge mechanism on the leaf. I cut it at the wrong angle the first time. I need to recut the whole thing." "So do it." "I will." "When?" He looked at her. "When I get to it." "You've been getting to it for 4 months." "I know." A pause. "It's annoying to be wrong about a cut. I've been letting it sit." Victoria looked at the table. "I do that," she said. "Do what?" "Leave things I got wrong sitting longer than I should." She looked back at him. "In my case, they're usually personnel decisions." "What does that mean?" "It means I knew about Marcus for longer than I let myself know," she said. "He'd been distant since January. I noticed, and I didn't do anything about it because he'd been with the foundation for 8 years and I didn't want to be wrong about him." She paused. "Same principle. Different material." Liam looked at her. Then he looked at the Pembroke table. Then he went and picked up the cutting gauge and pulled the table to the center of the bench. "Fair point," he said. She watched him work for a while. He was, she had concluded over these weeks, someone who processed most things physically. Through the hands, through the work, through the specific problem solving that required both thought and touch. He didn't talk through problems as much as he worked through them, and the talking came after, quieter and more resolved. She was the opposite. She thought out loud, in structured arguments, in conversations that were sometimes less conversations than they were organized monologues with a willing audience. She'd had fewer of those than she'd realized until she was regularly in proximity to someone who would sit and listen to one. "Can I tell you what I think the board's going to do?" she said one evening at the kitchen table, late. "Go ahead," Liam said. "I think there are 5 solid votes for me regardless of the challenge outcome. I think there are 3 who are legitimately undecided. They liked my grandfather. They respected his vision for the foundation, but they've never entirely been comfortable with how young I was when he named me. And I think there are 2 who have been in communication with Vincent's team since before the challenge was filed." "Do you know which 2? "I have strong suspicions." "But not proof." "Not yet," she traced the edge of the table. "The hearing isn't about the 2 I'll lose or the 5 I'll keep. It's about the 3 in the middle, and those 3 are going to want to see—" She stopped. "See what?" "Evidence that I have something to lose beyond the foundation," she said. "My grandfather built that institution out of personal conviction, personal history. They watched him do it. When he chose me, part of what he was betting on was that I had the same ground underneath me, that I wasn't just competent, but that I actually had something at stake that wasn't strategic." Liam was quiet. And you're worried they'll see through it, he said. I'm worried there's nothing to see through too, she said. The honesty of it surprised even her. She hadn't meant to say it quite that plainly. She looked at the table and felt the specific discomfort of having said something true in a direction she hadn't fully looked yet. Victoria, Liam said. She looked up. You came to my workshop because you were desperate, he said. Okay, but desperate for what? To save the foundation. You could have found another lawyer, another workaround, another angle. You came to me because someone was about to destroy something irreplaceable, and you couldn't stand it. He paused. That's not strategy. That's conviction. She looked at him. That's the ground, he said. Right there. You don't have to manufacture it. She didn't answer immediately. She sat with it for a moment, the specific sensation of someone handing you back something you'd been trying to locate and had given up finding. You're better at this than you think, she said finally. At what? Talking to people. I talk to my daughter all day, he said. She's raised the bar. Outside, the Savannah night was doing its thing, the tree frogs and the distant traffic and the warm, heavy air that felt even through the walls. Inside the kitchen, the overhead light was still too bright, and the faucet still took 45 seconds, and the third stair still creaked. Victoria stood and took her mug to the sink. She stood there a moment, looking at the window above the sink, at the dark yard outside. The pecan tree was just visible. Sophie had, 3 days ago, declared that one particular branch of the pecan tree was officially hers, and had attempted to climb it with results that were more determined than successful. She scraped her knee on that tree, Victoria said. I know, I put the bandage on. She didn't cry. She waited until she thought I wasn't looking, Liam said, and then she cried for about 30 seconds. Then she stopped and went back and tried the branch again. Victoria turned off the faucet and dried her hands. She's going to be remarkable, she said. She already is, Liam said. She just doesn't know how much work that's going to cost her yet. Victoria thought about that on the way upstairs. The third stair announced her. The lamp in her room was even, the shade perfectly straight. She sat on the bed and looked at the botanical print on the wall, the yard sale framing and the careful hanging. And she thought about what Liam had said. The ground was there. She'd been looking for it in the wrong places. Looking for it in the strategic structure of the marriage, in the legal documents, in the public record. It had been sitting at a kitchen table 3 weeks ago when Sophie slid a worksheet across and asked what formidable meant. She picked up her phone. 14 new messages. She went through them with her usual efficiency, flagging, deferring, responding briefly to the 2 that required it. Then she put the phone down. Then she picked it up again. She opened her contacts and found a name she hadn't called in 2 years. Dr. Edaeze Okonkwo, who had been her grandfather's chief archivist, who had retired to Charleston, who had written Victoria a letter when the old man died that Victoria had read once and filed and not responded to because she didn't know how to respond to someone who knew her grandfather the way Dr. Okonkwo had, and could therefore see, probably, exactly how much of him Victoria was afraid she wasn't. She looked at the contact. Then she put the phone down again. Not tonight. But she was aware, which was more than she'd been 2 weeks ago. She turned off the light and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her. Liam moving in his room, the familiar soft creak of him sitting on the bed, the house finding its overnight arrangement. And she thought about how odd it was that the most disarming thing about this situation was not the legal pressure or the public scrutiny or even the strange intimacy of sharing a home with near strangers. It was that she'd stopped, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, anticipating the moment it would fall apart. She hadn't noticed when that happened. It had happened anyway. The crisis, when it came, arrived not through the press or the lawyers, but through a Tuesday morning at 7:45 when Victoria was in the kitchen and Sophie appeared in the doorway in her school clothes, and something about her face was different. What's wrong? Victoria said, before she'd made the conscious decision to ask. Sophie stood in the doorway. She was holding something, a folded piece of paper, the kind of printout that came from a school printer. She held it with both hands and looked at Victoria with an expression that was trying very hard to be the normal 7-year-old expression and not quite managing it. Someone at school, Sophie said. They said... She stopped, started again. They said you're only here because you needed a dad for pretend, and now you'll leave when you're done, and my real dad is going to be sad again. The kitchen was very quiet. Victoria looked at the piece of paper in Sophie's hands without asking what was on it. She looked at this child. This 7-year-old who had already learned to cry in 30-second intervals when she thought no one was watching, who climbed back up trees after scraping her knee, who had absorbed Victoria's presence into her daily life, with the pragmatic openness of someone who had decided that love was a practice you extended to people and waited to see what came back. And she felt something in her chest that was not strategic and was not manageable and was not going to be filed. She crossed the kitchen and crouched down to Sophie's eye level. "Can I see?" she said. Sophie handed over the paper. It was a printout, the gossip site, the one with the mystery husband headline, a follow-up article. Someone's parent had printed it, or a child had found it somehow. The specific avenue didn't matter. Victoria looked at it. Then she folded it and held it. "Sophie," she said, "look at me." Sophie looked at her. "I can't promise you what the future looks like," Victoria said. She said it carefully, because she was someone who said careful things, but she said it to Sophie's actual face, with Sophie's actual eyes looking back at her. And the carefulness was not distance. It was the carefulness of telling a child something true. "What I can tell you is that your dad is one of the best people I've ever been around, and that being here it's mattered to me in a way I didn't expect." Sophie was quiet. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means that whatever happens, it wasn't pretend for me," Victoria said. "Okay? It wasn't pretend." Sophie studied her, the serious dark eyes that looked so much like Liam's did when he was taking stock of something. "Okay," Sophie said. Then she looked at the clock on the microwave. "I'm going to be late." "Go get your bag," Victoria said. Sophie disappeared into the hallway. Victoria stood up and put the folded paper on the counter and stood there for a moment with her hand on it. Liam appeared at the bottom of the stairs, car keys already in hand, running a minute behind the usual schedule. He looked at Victoria, then at the paper under her hand. "Everything okay?" he said. "Sophie had a hard morning," Victoria said. "Someone at school—" She gestured at the paper. Liam picked it up, looked at it, put it back down. His jaw tightened briefly. "I'll talk to her in the car," he said. "I already did." He looked at her. "I told her it wasn't pretend," Victoria said. "For me." Something moved across Liam Carter's face that was not the careful evenness she'd come to know as his default register. It was there and gone quickly, but it was there. Something open and unguarded, something that looked like it cost him. He looked down at the paper. "Thank you," he said, quietly. Sophie came thundering back down the hall with her backpack, which had already survived another morning of not being put on until the last possible moment. "Bye, Victoria," she said at the door. "Have a good day," Victoria said. The door closed. The gravel crunched under the truck tires. Victoria stood alone in the kitchen in the too bright overhead light and looked at the yard through the window and did not go immediately to her phone. She stood there for a while, long enough for the hot water to arrive from the cold tap, long enough to let the morning be what it was. She had told Sophie the truth. She had not done the calculation first, had not checked whether the truth was strategically appropriate, had not moderated it through Christine or through the practiced phrasing she used for public statements. She had looked at a 7-year-old's face and said what was actually true. It wasn't pretend. Not anymore. Maybe not for longer than she'd been admitting to herself. She poured her coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop, and the day's work spread out in front of her the way it always did. The foundation, the legal filings, the board preparations, the 27 things that required her attention before noon. She worked through them steadily. She did it sitting at the kitchen table instead of the foundation office, which was where she usually worked mornings, and the window was there, and the pecan tree was there, and the bench where Sophie had scraped her knee was visible, and none of that was in the surveillance photographs, because the surveillance photographs had only ever captured her leaving. She stayed until it was time to go to the foundation, and then she went, and then she came back at 5. Liam was in the workshop. She set her bag down inside the house and came around back. "How was she?" Victoria said from the doorway. "Quiet in the car," he said. He was reassembling the Pembroke table, the rule joint, finally cut correctly, the leaf swinging smoothly. "Then she told me what the kid said. Then she told me what you said." "And?" He looked at her over the table. The late light came through the open doors and laid a long stripe across the concrete floor between them. Then she said, and I quote, "I think Victoria is formidable," he said. Victoria felt something crack open in her chest, not painfully, the way cracks usually felt, but the way old wood cracks along its grain when it finally expands back into the right humidity. A relief. A rightness. She laughed. Actually laughed. Not the controlled, professionally appropriate version, but the genuine one that surprised her slightly by its own existence. Liam smiled. The real one. The one she'd seen only a few times. The one that started in his eyes and arrived at his mouth a second later like an afterthought. Yeah, he said. I thought you'd like that. She stood in the workshop doorway while he finished the Pembroke table, the rule joint clicking smoothly into position, the leaf finally doing what it was always supposed to do. And she didn't say anything, and neither did he, and the afternoon settled around them both with the particular patience of things that have been waiting to find their proper arrangement. 3 weeks until the board hearing. She was not afraid of it the way she'd been afraid of it before. Not because anything had been resolved, not because the legal situation had changed or the surveillance evidence had disappeared or Vincent's people had become any less thorough, but because she had walked into a workshop 1 month ago, desperate and strategic and controlled, and she had been taken in anyway, into the dinner table and the routine and the creak of the third stair and the shop stool and the soup that Sophie made badly from a can. And something in all of that had been doing a slow, quiet work on her that she hadn't supervised and hadn't managed. The absence was still real. Christine wasn't wrong about that. But it was getting smaller, and what was replacing it did not feel manufactured. She went inside and started dinner because Liam had been in the workshop since early morning, and because she knew how the stove worked now, and because Sophie would be home in 40 minutes, and because this was Tuesday, and on Tuesdays they had dinner together, not because it was a rule, because it was what they did. The 2 weeks before the hearing moved the way time moves when something large is approaching, faster in the aggregate, unbearably slow in individual hours. Victoria had been in high-pressure situations before. She'd navigated a hostile acquisition attempt at 26, a public funding scandal at 28, that had nothing to do with her but landed on her desk anyway, and a board vote at 29 that she'd won by one margin and one margin only. She knew how to function under pressure. She knew how to sleep 4 hours and operate at full capacity and eat standing over a kitchen counter without registering what she was eating. What she didn't know how to do, she was discovering, was function under pressure while also being accountable to a household. It was the small things that got her. The night she came home at 9 and found dinner on the stove because Liam had left it there without comment, just covered with a plate on top to keep it warm. The morning Sophie needed something signed for school, and Victoria was already halfway through a legal brief on her laptop and had to surface, completely, from the thing she'd been inside, not partially surface, not the distracted half-attention she'd given to assistants for years, but actually surface, because Sophie could tell when adults were only pretending to be present, and she found it offensive. "You're doing the face," Sophie told her one morning, when Victoria signed the field trip form without reading it. "What face?" "The one where you're not here." Victoria put down her pen. "Where am I?" "I don't know. Somewhere with lawyers, probably." Sophie took the form back with a mild air of someone managing a recurring issue. "It's fine. I just wanted you to know." Victoria looked at her. "Thank you for telling me." "You're welcome," Sophie said, with the graciousness of someone who considered this the correct social response and had practiced it. The depositions happened in the second week. Christine had prepared Victoria extensively, 3 sessions, each 2 hours, running through the anticipated questions and the appropriate answers, and the places where honesty and legal strategy aligned, and the places where they needed to be handled carefully. Victoria was a good deponent. She was precise, she didn't over-answer, she caught herself before speculation and redirected to fact. Vincent's attorney was a man named Garrett Foss, who had the particular quality of someone who'd built a career on catching people in the small untruths they told to make themselves look better. He was methodical. He was, Victoria admitted to herself on the drive home afterward, good. He asked about the circumstances of their meeting. She answered. He asked about the timeline. How many days elapsed between their first meeting and the courthouse ceremony? She answered. He asked about Sophie. Christine objected twice. Foss rephrased twice. The third version got through. Had Victoria formed a relationship with the child prior to the marriage? And Victoria had said yes, which was true, and then Foss had let it sit. Let the timeline implication sit in the room, the implication that one day was not enough time to form anything genuine, and moved on. She came home that night and stood in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the overhead light. Just stood in the dark with the refrigerator hum and the tree frogs outside, and the particular quality of a house that contained sleeping people, which was different from a house that contained no one. She heard Liam's footsteps on the stairs. The third step announced him. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at her standing in the dark, and said nothing. He crossed to the counter and turned on the small lamp above the stove, which threw a lower, less aggressive light than the overhead, and made the kitchen look like somewhere a person could actually breathe. "How'd it go?" he said. "It went the way depositions go," she said. "He's building what he's building. Christine's building what she's building." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He was leaning against the counter in a t-shirt and the worn jeans he changed into after work, and he looked the way he always looked at this hour, tired in a clean, uncomplicated way, like someone who had spent his energy on real things and was now ready to stop. "He asked about Sophie," she said. Something moved across Liam's face. "What kind of question?" "A careful one. Whether I'd formed a relationship with her before the marriage. Technically it was neutral. It wasn't neutral." Liam was quiet. "He's going to imply that Sophie is part of the staging," Victoria said. "That her presence, the image of a ready-made family, made the arrangement more convincing, that I leveraged her." "That's—" Liam stopped, started again. "That's not what happened." "I know that." "Do they know that?" "They know what they can prove." She looked at the stove lamp. "Which is why it's the version they'll use." Liam pushed off the counter and pulled a chair out from the kitchen table. Not for himself, for her. The specific quiet utility of the gesture. She sat. He sat across from her. "Listen to me," he said. "Sophie isn't a prop. She was never a prop. Anyone who has spent 20 minutes in this house knows that. Vincent's attorneys haven't spent 20 minutes in this house. The board has eyes," he said. "They know you. They knew your grandfather. They can— 3 of them can go either way," she said. "And they're going to look at the evidence Foss presents, and they're going to make a decision about whether this family is real. And I need them to see something real." She paused. "Not because of the strategy. Because it is real, and I don't know how to show that without it looking like I'm trying to show it." Liam looked at her across the kitchen table. "You know what the problem is?" he said. "Tell me. You're trying to solve it the way you solve everything, structurally. You want to produce the evidence of realness the same way you produce evidence of anything else." He tapped the table once. "But that's not how people read real. They read it sideways. They read it in the things you're not doing on purpose." Victoria looked at him. "What does that mean practically?" she said. "It means stop trying to perform not performing," he said. "Just be here. The way you've been here the last 2 weeks. Come to the workshop. Have dinner. Help Sophie with her report on the historical artifact. She still hasn't started, by the way, because she got distracted by the field trip thing. She told me about the field trip thing. Then you know it's been a whole ongoing situation." He leaned back. "The board hearing is 1 day. Everything before it is 30-something days of a life. You've been living it. That's the thing you have to show them." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "And you? What about me? Will you—" She stopped. It was a harder question than it should have been. "Will you come to the hearing?" Liam looked at her like this was a question he found slightly strange. "Yes," he said. "Obviously. I didn't want to assume— Victoria, you're my wife." He said it the way he said most direct things. Plainly, without underlining it, like it was simply true. "Of course I'm coming." She looked at the table, the wobbling corner, the cardstock shim she'd noticed months ago, and had never mentioned because it was fine. It was a practical solution. It was exactly the kind of functional imperfection this kitchen operated on. "Okay," she said. She went upstairs. The third step announced her. She lay in the dark in her room and looked at the ceiling and felt the strange, suspended quality of being 2 weeks from something large, when the outcome was still genuinely unknown, and all you could do was stay inside the life you'd built and hope it held. The next morning she woke at 5:30 and went downstairs and found Liam already in the kitchen. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he said. He was making coffee, his back to her. There was something slightly tight in his posture that she'd learned over weeks to notice. "I've been thinking about the deposition. It's done. There's nothing— not the legal strategy." He turned around. "I've been thinking about what Foss implied. About Sophie." His jaw was set in the particular way it set when he'd been sitting with something overnight and had reached the end of his ability to sit with it. "I want to be in the room when they make that argument." "You will be." "I mean, I want to be able to say something." "Liam, I know I'm not a lawyer. I know Christine has a plan. I'm just—" He put his coffee down. "She's my daughter. And she didn't ask to be anywhere near this. I know, Victoria said. She loves you, he said. That's not something she managed. That's not something I managed. You were there, and you were honest with her, and she decided. He looked at Victoria directly. I need the people in that room to understand that. Victoria looked at him. The kitchen was quiet, the pre-dawn light coming gray through the window, the house still in its nighttime state. Then tell them, she said. What? Tell them exactly what you just told me, she said. In the hearing, when Christine gives you the floor. I'm not... He stopped. I'm not a public speaker. I know, that's why it'll work. He looked at her. Then he picked his coffee back up and turned toward the window, and she could see him turning it over. The discomfort of it, the exposure of it, the fact that he'd said the thing once and saying it again in a room full of lawyers and board members was a different thing entirely. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. The night before the hearing, they didn't talk about it. Liam spent the afternoon in the workshop finishing a commission that was 2 days past due, and Victoria sat at the kitchen table going through notes she'd been through 4 times already. And Sophie came home from school and did her homework, and they had dinner. Chicken that Victoria had made imperfectly because she'd been distracted and the garlic had gone darker than intended, and she'd contemplated starting over and decided against it. It's a little burnt, Sophie said. I know, Victoria said. It's still good, Liam said. He wasn't lying. He was just someone who had calibrated his expectations to actual food made by actual people and found this completely acceptable. Sophie ate it without further editorial. Then she looked at Victoria with the serious, appraising expression she brought to important things. Are you scared about tomorrow? Sophie, Liam started. A little, Victoria said. Sophie considered this. My teacher says being scared means you care about something. Your teacher's right. Are you scared you'll lose the foundation? Partly. Sophie ate another forkful. What's the other part? Victoria looked at her, 7 years old and already asking the right question underneath the obvious question. She'd gotten that from somewhere, and it wasn't hard to figure out where. The other part, Victoria said carefully, is that whatever happens with the foundation, I don't want to leave this house the same person who walked into your dad's workshop. Sophie looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Liam. Some 7-year-old calculation happened behind her eyes. You're not, Sophie said, and went back to the slightly burnt chicken with the finality of someone who had said what needed saying. Liam met Victoria's eyes across the table. His face was the careful, even one, but underneath it, just visible, was that open thing she'd seen a handful of times, the one that cost him. She looked down at her plate. After dinner, after Sophie was in bed, after the house had found its nighttime arrangement, Victoria sat in the workshop. She didn't have a reason. She'd started doing it some evenings. Sitting on her stool in the quiet after the day's work, when the space held only the smell of it, and the pieces in their various states of becoming, and the very particular silence of a place that was used hard and rested clean. Liam came in around 9. He looked at her, looked at the stool, and pulled the second one from behind the workbench. You don't have to be in here, he said. I know, she said. I want to be. He sat. The workshop was quiet around them. Can I tell you something? She said. Go ahead. When my grandfather died, he left me a letter, she said, along with the estate documents. I've read it probably 100 times. She looked at her hands in her lap. He said he chose me not because I was the most capable person he knew, but because I was the one who still got angry when something was wrong. He said capability without anger was just management. He needed someone who would get angry. Liam was quiet. I've been trying to prove I'm capable my whole career, she said. I think I forgot about the anger part. You're angry now? Liam said. Yes. About the collection. About all of it, she said. The collection. Samuel Hale walking 300 miles in no shoes to build something that his great-great-granddaughter almost let get sold for parts because she was too busy managing her image to notice her assistant was being turned. She paused. I'm angry about Marcus. I should have seen it. You did see it, he said. You said so yourself. You just didn't want to be right. That's not an excuse. It's not an excuse, and he agreed. It's a human thing. He looked at the Pembroke table, finished now, the rule joint moving perfectly, sitting in the corner under a clean cloth waiting for pickup. I sat with a wrong cut for 4 months. Victoria almost smiled. A Pembroke table isn't a foundation. No, but the thing that makes you avoid looking at the problem is the same thing. He turned back to her. You fixed it. You saw it. You named it, and you fixed it. That's the job. The workshop held them both in its particular quiet. Liam, she said. Yeah. Whatever happens tomorrow. She stopped. Started again. I want you to know that this has mattered to me. Not the legal situation. This. She made it a small gesture. At the workshop. At the house. At the general direction of everything. You and Sophie in this impractical house with the cold tap and the loud stare. He looked at her. The tap takes 45 seconds, he said. I know. I've been counting. Something in his expression softened. Not dramatically, not in a way that would photograph, but the specific softening of someone who has heard something that landed in exactly the place it was aimed. It matters to me too, he said, quietly. They sat in the workshop until 10:30, not talking about the hearing, mostly not talking at all, and then they went inside and up the creaking stairs and into their respective rooms, and Victoria lay in the dark and thought about her grandfather's letter, and about anger, and about capability, and about the difference between managing a life and actually inhabiting one. She slept better than she expected to. The Hale Foundation's boardroom was on the 3rd floor of the same historic district building where Victoria's office lived, and it had been designed, Victoria had always suspected, specifically to intimidate. High ceilings, tall windows overlooking Whitfield Square, a long mahogany table that had been in that room since her grandfather presided over it. Liam put on a jacket. She noticed this because he'd mentioned once that he owned exactly 2 jackets, one for funerals and one for things that weren't funerals, but required some approximation of formality. He appeared at the bottom of the stairs in the one that wasn't for funerals, and stood in the kitchen while Victoria gathered her documents, and she looked at him and didn't say anything about it but felt something warm and complicated in her chest. Sophie, being a school day, was not there, but she had left a note on the kitchen table, written in the oversized, careful printing of a 7-year-old who was working on her cursive and defaulted to print under pressure. It said, "You are formidable, both of you." Liam picked it up, looked at it, set it back down carefully, the way he set things down when they required care. She spelled formidable right, Victoria said. I know, he said. She practiced it. They drove together in his truck. The boardroom held 11 people when they arrived, which was almost everyone. 8 board members, Christine, Garrett Foss, and a court-appointed mediator named Renata Saul, who sat at the end of the table with the patient neutrality of someone whose job required her to have no opinion about anything. Vincent was there, positioned at the opposite end of the table from Victoria, in a suit that cost more than the Pembroke table, and with an expression that communicated confidence without quite tipping into gloating. He looked at Liam with the particular attention of someone who has researched a subject extensively and is now seeing it in person for the first time. Liam looked back at him without expression. The proceeding opened formally, Saul establishing parameters, Christine and Foss introducing their positions for the record. Victoria had been in enough legal proceedings to run on autopilot through the procedural architecture, her attention going to the 3 board members she'd identified as undecided. Edmund Carr, the 72-year-old retired attorney who had been on the board since her grandfather's tenure. Patricia Mensah, 60, a cultural preservation scholar from Atlanta who had been appointed 3 years ago. And David Long, 55, a businessman from Charleston who had made his money in real estate and whom Victoria had always found difficult to fully read. Carr sat with his hands folded. Mensah had a notepad. Long was watching Victoria with the specific attentiveness of someone not yet decided. Foss went first. He was methodical, as Victoria had expected. He laid out the timeline, the 1-day gap between meeting and marriage, the pre-existing documentation from surveillance, the statement from Marcus Walsh, carefully framed as a concern raised by a long-term foundation employee about the circumstances of the marriage rather than as an explicit accusation. He presented 4 photographs. Victoria leaving the house at 7 a.m. on the day after the wedding. Victoria arriving at the foundation office at 7:15. Victoria leaving the foundation at 7:45 p.m. Victoria arriving back at the house. The photographs were taken on the same day. They looked exactly like what they were, 2 separate lives briefly sharing an address. The room was quiet while Foss spoke. Victoria watched the board. Carr's expression didn't change. Mensah made 2 notes. Long's attentiveness sharpened slightly. Then Christine presented her response, and it was thorough. Legal precedent, the foundation's governing documents, the specific language of the estate clause, The fact that no legal standard required a marriage to meet any particular standard of romantic convention in order to be valid. All of it was correct. All of it was technically sufficient. And Victoria could feel, in the temperature of the room, that technically sufficient was not enough. Then Christine said, "I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Carter." Foss objected. Saul overruled. And Liam Carter, who owned 2 jackets and had spent the last 6 weeks feeding a billionaire's daughter impractical soup and showing her how to read the grain of old wood, leaned forward in his chair and spoke. He wasn't polished. He was the opposite of polished. He was deliberate, the way people are deliberate when they're saying something they've thought about hard and don't want to get wrong. And he looked at the board rather than at his hands, which Victoria suspected cost him. He said that he was a furniture restorer from Savannah. He said he'd been a widower for 3 years and a father for 7. He said he'd lived a specific and small life by choice and hadn't been looking to change it. Then he said, "The day Victoria walked into my workshop, she told me about her foundation and about the collection, about Samuel Hale and what he spent his life doing and why. And I want to tell you that I restore furniture for a living, and one of the things that bothers me most about this work is attribution. Who built it? Usually we don't know. The piece survives and the person doesn't." He paused. The idea that there was a collection somewhere that kept both the work and the names, and that collection was about to be broken apart, and the names would disappear again. He stopped. I couldn't sit with that, so I said yes. The room was very still. "That's not strategy," he said. "That's just what I believe." He looked at Victoria, directly, across the table. Not for effect, not for the board, but the way you look at someone when you're saying something to them that happens to be audible to other people. And I'll tell you something else. I have a 7-year-old daughter. She decides who she trusts, and she's better at it than most adults I know. She decided about Victoria in about 3 days. He looked back at the board. I pay attention to that. He stopped. He'd said what he came to say. He didn't add anything to make it land better. He just sat with it, in the slightly uncomfortable way of someone who has said a true thing and knows that the truth doesn't automatically win anything, and is at peace with having said it anyway. The room stayed quiet for a moment longer than it needed to. Then Edmund Carr, who had not changed expression once during Foss's presentation, unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the mahogany table. "I knew Ezra Hale for 30 years, he said. He said it to no one in particular, or to everyone. He used to tell me that the hardest thing about building something meant to last was finding people who understood that preservation wasn't about keeping things the same. It was about keeping them true." He looked at Victoria, then at Liam. "I think we've heard enough." Foss started to object. Carr looked at him with the patience of a 72-year-old who has outlasted a great many objections. Foss stopped. Patricia Mensah put down her pen. "I'd like to call for the vote," she said. What happened next took 14 minutes. 14 minutes of procedural formality. The motion, the seconds, the individual votes recorded by Renata Saul at the end of the table with the same professional neutrality she'd maintained throughout. 8 board members, 1 mediator, 1 legal challenge that had been building for 6 weeks, and that resolved, in the end, in the same quiet room where Ezra Hale had once sat at the head of a mahogany table and decided what his life's work would amount to. 7-1. The one was the board member Victoria had expected, a man named Pierce, who had been in Vincent's corner since January and whose vote surprised no one. The 7 included David Long, which surprised Victoria slightly, and which she filed away for later consideration. Garrett Foss gathered his documents with the practiced efficiency of a professional who had lost cases before and had developed a system for the aftermath. He said the appropriate legal things to Christine. He did not look at Victoria. Vincent looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since they were children, and their grandfather had started making his preferences clear, with the particular expression of someone who believes a wrong has been done to them and has organized their entire adult life around that belief, and now has to figure out what they're made of without it. Victoria looked back at him. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. The space between them contained 30 years of a story. She was tired of being a character in, and the vote had ended a chapter of it, and the rest of it was his to carry. He left without speaking. Christine was immediately in Victoria's ear. Next steps, foundation governance, press release language, the 3 things that needed to happen before end of business. And Victoria listened and nodded and confirmed what needed confirming. Liam stood slightly apart, near the windows overlooking Whitfield Square, in the jacket that wasn't for funerals. He was looking out at the square with his hands in his pockets, and he had the expression of someone who has done an uncomfortable thing and is now processing the fact that it's over. She crossed the room to him. "Thank you," she said. He turned from the window. "You would have won anyway." "Maybe." Christine had it covered. "Liam." He looked at her. "You told them about Samuel Hale," she said. "A room full of lawyers and foundation board members, and you led with a freedman born in 1849, who walked barefoot to Savannah to spend 40 years making sure names didn't disappear." She paused. "That wasn't for the legal record. That was because it was the right thing to say." He was quiet for a moment. "It was the true thing," he said. "Same thing," she said. "In that room today. Same thing." Outside, through the tall windows, Whitfield Square was doing what southern squares did in early afternoon, sitting in the dense amber light, with the patience of a place that had survived centuries of things happening in and around it, and had developed, from that survival, a kind of foundational calm. Victoria looked at it, then back at Liam. "Sophie gets out at 3:15, she said. "I know," he said. "We should pick her up together," she said. "Tell her in person." Liam looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "we should." They left the boardroom together, walking out through the building's front entrance into the Savannah afternoon. The heat, the particular light, the smell of the city that was old wood and river and green things all at once. Christine was on her phone behind them. The black sedan was at the curb, the driver already moving toward the door. Victoria glanced at it. Then she looked at Liam's truck, parked half a block down. "Can we take your truck?" she said. He looked at her with the slight raise of an eyebrow that was as close as he got to surprise. "It's not comfortable." "I know," she said. "I don't care." He reached into his jacket pocket for his keys. They walked down the block together in the Savannah heat, not touching, not saying anything, through the amber light and the smell of the city, toward a truck that needed new shocks, and had a radio stuck on a country station he'd never gotten around to changing. Victoria got into the passenger seat. The leather was hot from the sun. She rolled down the window the way you roll down a window in a truck, manually, with the little handle, 4 rotations, and the air came in warm and real. Liam started the engine. The radio came on. Some song she didn't recognize. He pulled out into the street. The legal challenge was over. The foundation was hers. The collection was safe. And sitting in the passenger seat of a truck that wasn't comfortable, with the window down in the Savannah heat, on the way to pick up a 7-year-old girl from the 3rd grade, Victoria Hale felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, exactly. Not victory. Something quieter than both of those. Something that had been growing in the margins of the last 6 weeks, without her supervision, in all the spaces she hadn't been managing, the workshop evenings, and the Tuesday dinners, and the 45 seconds of cold tap water, and the 3rd stare, and the botanical print, and the note that said, "You are formidable, both of you." She didn't name it yet. She just let it sit there in the passenger seat beside her while Savannah moved past the window, and the country station played something she didn't know the words to. That was enough for now. That was more than enough. Sophie found out in the truck, on the way back from school. Liam told her straight. The board voted. The foundation stays with Victoria. The collection is protected. He said it simply, the way he said things to Sophie, without the softening that adults often applied to children, under the mistaken assumption that children couldn't handle direct information. Sophie had always found the softening more confusing than the truth. She listened from the back seat with her backpack on her lap, and her hands folded on top of it. "So it's over?" she said. "That part of it," Liam said. Sophie looked out the window. The Savannah streets moved past. The Spanish moss, the squares, the particular afternoon light that turned everything slightly golden in late October. Then she looked at Victoria in the passenger seat. "Are you happy?" she said. Victoria turned to look at her. The question was so direct it almost required a moment to absorb. "Yes," she said. "I am." "Good," Sophie said, and looked back out the window with the settled finality of someone who has confirmed what she needed to confirm and is now ready to move on to other things. She was quiet the rest of the drive, but when they pulled into the gravel drive and she got out of the truck, she walked around to the passenger side and took Victoria's hand, briefly, matter-of-factly, the way she sometimes took Liam's hand when something had required courage and was now finished, and then let go and went inside. Victoria stood by the truck for a moment after the screen door closed. Liam was watching her from the other side of the hood. She does that sometimes, he said. She processes things, and then she puts her hand in yours. It's how you know she's been carrying something. Victoria looked at the screen door. I know, she said. She does it with you too. I've noticed. Liam looked at her for a moment. Then he went inside. The weeks immediately following the board hearing had a strange texture to them, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, like the pressure of one thing had been lifted to reveal the weight of something underneath that had been there all along. The foundation work expanded to fill the space that the legal fight had occupied. Victoria had a backlog of decisions that had been deferred, a restructuring of the archive department that had been half-planned since March, and the first serious conversations about the Samuel Hale collection being made accessible to scholars and institutions in a structured way, not sold, not dispersed, but opened with proper documentation and academic rigor. She had called Dr. Adaeze Okonkwo. The conversation had lasted 2 hours and ended with plans for Dr. Okonkwo to come to Savannah in the new year. It was good work. It was the kind of work her grandfather had intended her for, and she understood that now in a way she hadn't entirely understood it before, not as obligation, but as inheritance, the real kind, the kind that costs something. But alongside the work, something else was happening that she had less framework for. The house had settled into a shape that included her, not accommodated her, that implied effort, adjustment, the ongoing negotiation of a temporary arrangement. It had simply grown around her the way a living thing grows around what is consistently present. Her coffee mug occupied a specific spot on the counter. Her coat had a hook by the back door. On the second Tuesday of November, Sophie assigned her a specific role in the field trip fundraiser that was clearly non-negotiable and that Victoria fulfilled by baking brownies, imperfectly, with the consultation of a recipe that she followed precisely and which still produced results that were slightly too dense on one edge, and delivering them in the morning with the other parents. She stood in the school parking lot at 7:45 with a container of dense on one edge brownies and talked to a woman named Dara, whose son was in Sophie's class, and she thought, I have not stood in a school parking lot making conversation with another parent since approximately never. And then she thought, I am doing this, and then she thought, and it doesn't feel like performing. Liam watched her from slightly further down the line of parents, the specific way he watched things, attentively and without making it obvious. When they were walking back to his truck after drop-off, he said, You talked to Dara Flemons for 10 minutes. I know, she's interesting. She's a marine biologist. She's been at this school for 2 years. She's interesting to everyone. You looked comfortable. I was comfortable, Victoria said, and then registered that this was true. Not strategically comfortable, not managed impression comfortable, but just comfortable. Standing in a school parking lot in November, talking to a stranger about the logistics of baking brownies and the habitat preferences of coastal fish. Liam looked at her with the sideways expression he got when something pleased him that he wasn't going to make a thing of. Okay, he said. Don't say it like that. Like what? Like you're noting something for the record. I'm not noting anything. You have a face, she said. You've been talking to Sophie too much. She almost laughed. The almost laugh had become, over weeks, a real laugh more often than not. Not the controlled version, the genuine one that caught her slightly off guard when it arrived, as if some part of her was still surprised that this house produced it. But underneath the lightning, underneath the school parking lots, and the workshop evenings, and the dinners that had become, without formal declaration, the organizing structure of the household's days, there was something that Victoria had been not looking at in the specific way she'd learned to not look at the Pembroke table. She could feel its outline. She knew its general shape. She had been giving it exactly the amount of space that allowed her to continue functioning. Her legal arrangement with Liam had a term. The estate clause deadline had passed with the board vote. The legal challenge was resolved. The specific crisis that had sent her down a gravel drive to a furniture workshop on a Tuesday afternoon in October was over. The contract, the document she'd brought in the leather portfolio, the one she'd been so organized about, with its exit agreements and privacy protections, and the annulment provisions she'd spent 2 weeks having her attorney polish, that contract had a clear endpoint. She knew it. Liam knew it. They had not discussed it in approximately 4 weeks. The not discussing it had become its own thing, something that occupied space in the house the same way the photographs on the wall occupied space, present and acknowledged without being constantly addressed. She would be aware of it in the morning when she came downstairs and the kitchen smelled like coffee, and Liam was already in the workshop, and Sophie's backpack was already halfway to the floor, and she would feel the awareness of it like something sitting just outside her field of vision. And then she would pour her coffee and sit at the table and open her laptop and let the day move. The annulment papers arrived in her email from Christine on a Thursday morning in the second week of November. Not the papers themselves. Christine knew better than to send the papers without warning. It was a message. The documents are ready when you need them. No rush. There's no legal deadline now. I wanted you to have them available. Victoria read the email twice. Then she closed her laptop without responding to it. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The kitchen was empty. Liam was in the workshop. Sophie was at school. The house held its daytime quiet. The refrigerator, the tree frogs that had gone mostly silent now that October had moved into November, the distant sound of something in the workshop that suggested planning. She could tell his tools apart by sound now. The plane had a rhythm. The spokes halve was shorter, more variable. The mallet was unmistakable. She sat in the kitchen and listened to the plane and looked at the table, the wobbling corner, the cardstock shim, and thought about a question that was not a strategic question and did not have a strategic answer. What she wanted, not what was legally resolved, not what was structurally optimal, not what the foundation needed, or what Christine had prepared for, or what any reasonable person would advise given the circumstances. What she, Victoria Hale, actually wanted, in the specific and personal way that wanting things was either very simple or very complicated, depending on how long you'd been avoiding asking yourself. She sat with it for a while. She didn't rush it. The plain sound continued from the workshop. Steady. Patient. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, she found Liam in the kitchen doing what he did sometimes at this hour, sitting with a cup of coffee. He wasn't really drinking, turning something small over in his hands, the thinking object that varied but was always present. Tonight it was a wood screw, brass, the kind used in period hardware. He turned it over and over. Victoria sat across from him. Christine sent me the annulment papers, she said. The screw continued turning. He didn't stop the motion. Okay, he said. Not the papers. A note saying they're ready. Okay. She looked at him. You're not asking anything. I'm waiting for you to say what you came in here to say. She looked at the table, the wobbling corner, the shim. It had been there, she calculated, for as long as she'd been in this house. An imperfect fix for an actual problem, maintained by inertia and the daily practice of not getting around to doing it properly. I don't want to sign them, she said. The screw stopped. Liam looked at her. She kept her eyes on the table because looking at him while she said, the rest of this felt like more exposure than she was currently capable of, and she'd been honest about her limits before and she was being honest now. I have spent 6 weeks living in this house, she said, and somewhere in those 6 weeks something happened to me that I did not budget for and did not plan for and cannot, in good conscience, categorize as a side effect of a legal arrangement. She paused. I am in love with you. I'm fairly sure I have been for a while. And I know the situation is complicated, and I know you have a daughter and a life that you built specifically because you wanted it to be uncomplicated. And I know I came into it under circumstances that were not. She stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. I just needed to say it, she said, before I signed anything. I needed to say it because the alternative was not saying it, and I have spent my entire adult life not saying true things when the timing was inconvenient, and I'm tired of doing that. She looked up. Liam was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the careful even one. Not the one that cost him. Something different. Something she didn't have a category for because she'd never put it there. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. The papers, he said. What about them? Don't sign them. She looked at him. Not. He set the screw down and leaned forward, elbows on the table, and looked at her directly. Not because of the legal situation. That's done. Not because of the foundation. Not because Sophie likes you, even though she does, and you should know she doesn't like everyone. He paused. Don't sign them because I don't want you to. Victoria felt something in her chest that was large and slightly terrifying, and also, underneath that, the most settled feeling she'd had in years. Liam, I've been watching you in this house for 6 weeks, he said. I watched you sit on a shop stool in the workshop for an hour doing nothing because you needed to be somewhere that wasn't work. I watched you straighten a lampshade on the first night, and I watched you make impractical soup with Sophie, and I watched you crouch down in this kitchen and tell my daughter the truth when the easy thing would have been to soften it. He looked at her. And I'll tell you something. I have not, in 3 years, wanted anyone to stay. The word stayed in this kitchen. Not dramatic, just true. That's where I am, he said. That's been where I am for a while. He stopped, started again. I needed you to say it first because you're the one who could leave easier, and I needed to know. Victoria looked at him across the kitchen table, the impractical table with its impractical shim, in the kitchen with the overhead light that was too bright, and the tap that ran cold for 45 seconds, and the stare that announced everyone. I'm not leaving, she said. He looked at her, and the expression she didn't have a category for became something she would always know from this night forward. The specific, unguarded look of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told they can put it down. He reached across the table. Not a grand gesture. He put his hand over hers, the way you do when the thing you're trying to communicate is too large for language, and the only honest option is contact. She turned her hand over. They sat like that for a moment, in the too bright kitchen, in the quiet of the house. Then he said, "The third drawer of the dresser still sticks." She looked at him. "You said you were staying," he said. "I just want to be clear that the drawer is not going to be fixed anytime soon." Liam. The tap, too. 45 seconds is just what it does. I know, she said. I've stopped noticing. Good. He didn't move his hand. Because there's also the thing with the back porch step. The second one, not the first. The first is fine. It's been soft for about a year and I keep meaning to... Liam. Yeah. I love you. Love you, she said, including the porch step. He looked at her. Okay, he said quietly. They stayed at the table until 11, not talking about anything important, talking about everything else. She told him about Dr. Okonkwo's visit in January and the archive project. He told her about a commission he'd been offered, a private estate in Charleston, significant scope, the kind of project that would require him to think about expanding the business in ways he'd been putting off. She asked questions about the expansion, and he answered them, and she made 2 suggestions that were practical, and one that was, he said, too optimistic, and they disagreed about it for a while with the particular productive friction of people who think differently and are no longer bothered by that fact. The overhead light was still too bright. They neither of them did anything about it. When she went upstairs, third step, as always, she felt the weight of the not saying it lift off her chest in the complete and physical way that only happens when you've said the true thing to the right person and they've said something true back. What she didn't know, what she would only understand later, when she had enough distance to see the shape of the whole thing, was that the night of the board hearing, the night they'd sat on either side of the kitchen table, and she had not quite named the feeling, Liam had almost said it, had sat in his truck outside the school after dropping Sophie the following morning, and had gone through a version of the same conversation with himself that she'd been having for weeks. He'd written something down, which was not something he normally did. He'd found a receipt from the hardware store in his jacket pocket, and he'd written, "I don't want her to go." 5 words. He'd looked at it for a while and then folded it up and put it back in his pocket and driven home. Victoria found the receipt months later, much later, when she was going through the jacket pockets before taking it to be cleaned. She stood in the laundry room and unfolded it and read the 5 words and stood there for a while. She kept it, put it in the drawer of her nightstand, the one that wasn't sticky, and it stayed there. The harder conversation, the one that wasn't about feelings, but about practicalities, about the specific architecture of what staying actually meant, happened on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, when Sophie was at a friend's house and the house was quiet in the weekend way that was different from the weekday quiet. Liam was making breakfast. Victoria was at the kitchen table with her laptop, working the way she worked on Saturday mornings now, less urgently than weekdays, with the particular unhurried quality of someone who had learned that the work could wait for coffee. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "The expansion," she said. "The Charleston Commission. You said you'd been putting it off." "Yeah." He was at the stove, not facing her. "Why?" A pause. "Because expanding means hiring, means managing people, means the business becomes something different than it is now." "What is it now?" "Mine," he said. And then after a beat, "Manageable. I can do it myself and come home at the right time and be here when Sophie gets off the bus." "You could do both," she said carefully, "if the business had the right structure." "Victoria, I'm not—" "I know you're not," he said. He turned from the stove and looked at her. But you need to understand something. The small life isn't a failure condition. It wasn't a thing I fell into because I couldn't do better. I chose it. He paused. Claire and I chose it, and then she was gone and the small life was what was left. And it turned out it was enough. It was more than enough. It was good. He looked at her directly. I'm not ashamed of it. I know that, she said. I'm not asking you to be. I know you're not. He went back to the eggs. I know who you are. I know the scale of what you do. And I want to be honest with you about who I am, because that doesn't change. I'm not asking you to change, she said. She stopped, tried to say it right. I have lived at the scale I live at my whole career, and I can tell you that there is nothing at that scale that compares to sitting in a workshop at 9 p.m. doing nothing in particular. She looked at him. I'm not trying to expand your business or fix your priorities. I'm asking because I want to understand what your life looks like, so I can figure out how to be in it without breaking what's already good. Liam was quiet for a moment. Then he put the eggs on plates and brought them to the table and sat down across from her. Okay, he said. That's a fair question. Thank you. The commission, he said, I'll take it. I've been putting it off because I didn't know what the next 6 months looked like. I know better now. Good. But I don't want a business manager, he said. I don't want a brand. I want to do the work and do it well and come home. Okay. And I don't want... He stopped, looked at his plate. I don't want Sophie's life to change more than it already has. She's had enough change. I know, Victoria said. What does that look like practically? He said. For you, your office is in the city, the foundation. I can restructure, she said. I've been thinking about it. The archive project is going to require more on-site work, which actually means less time in the foundation office, more field work, more travel to partner institutions. But the base... She looked at the kitchen, the table, the stove, the view through the window. The base can be here, if that's what it is. Liam looked at her. You'd keep the foundation office, he said. Yes. But you'd be here. Yes. Your apartment in Charleston. I haven't been in it in 6 weeks, she said. It's been sitting there. I've been here. He looked at her across the breakfast table with the particular expression of someone taking inventory of a situation and finding that the numbers add up to something he hadn't fully let himself expect. The foundation board is going to have opinions, he said. They'll get over it. The press? Liam. He stopped. The press will say what they say, she said. They're going to say I leveraged the marriage for corporate gain and then fell for my own arrangement, or they're going to say it was a love story all along and they're going to be wrong about the timeline either way, and I cannot... She took a breath. I cannot make decisions about my life based on what the press is going to say about it. I tried that for 10 years. It doesn't end. He nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Okay, you agree, or okay, you're noting my point? Okay, both, he said. And he almost smiled, the real one. I first. And she felt it the way she always felt it, like something warm arriving that she hadn't known she was waiting for. They ate breakfast on the Saturday morning with the house quiet around them, the late November light coming through the kitchen window pale and clear, the pecan tree in the backyard bare now, its branches drawing clean lines against the sky. They talked about the Charleston Commission. They talked about the archive project. They talked about Sophie's ongoing campaign to be allowed a pet, which had been running for approximately 4 months and showed no signs of concluding. What kind of pet? Victoria said. She changes her answer every time, Liam said. It started as a dog, then a rabbit. Last week she said she wanted a tortoise. A tortoise is reasonable. He looked at her. Don't tell her that. Why not? Because then I have to say yes to a tortoise, he said. And I don't know anything about tortoises. I could research tortoises, Victoria said. Victoria. They're long-lived. You make a commitment once and it's done for decades. It's actually a very sensible... If we get a tortoise, Liam said, that is entirely your project. Fine, Victoria said. She said it without thinking, without running it through the usual calculation. And then she heard the we in what he'd said and let it sit there in the kitchen between them, unexamined, just present. We. The unremarkable, ordinary, enormous weight of it. She looked at her coffee cup and did not make a thing of it, and did not cry, which she was not a person who cried often, but she felt the specific pressure behind her eyes that meant the alternative existed. Sophie came home at 4, delivered by Dara Flemons, who also had a child at the birthday party, and had offered to do pickup. She came in loud and slightly sugared from the birthday cake, and with a great deal of information about the party that she delivered in one continuous stream from the back door to the kitchen table. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the kitchen. Victoria was at the counter. Liam was at the table. The two of them occupied the kitchen in the easy, unremarkable way of people who had been in a space together long enough to have stopped negotiating it. Sophie looked at this, the specific arrangement of it, the particular way two people take up space when they're comfortable, and her 7-year-old face went through something. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing happened," Liam said. "Something happened. You're both—" She made a gesture that was hard to interpret but seemed to indicate contentment. "Different." "Eat a real snack," Liam said. "You had cake." Sophie went to the refrigerator and stood there considering it. Then she looked over the door at Victoria. "Are you staying?" she said, the directness of it, always. Victoria looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." Sophie looked at the refrigerator contents for a moment longer. "Okay," she said, with the tone of someone confirming something she'd already decided was the correct outcome and was pleased to have verified. She took an apple and went to the kitchen table and started telling Liam the rest of the birthday party story, which turned out to involve a minor incident with a piñata that had clearly been the dramatic high point of the afternoon. Victoria stood at the counter and listened to Sophie describe the piñata incident with the forensic attention to detail that Sophie brought to any story involving chaos and a satisfying conclusion. Liam listened with the patience he brought to Sophie's stories, genuine attention, the specific quality of a parent who is not just waiting for the child to finish, but is actually interested in the piñata. Through the kitchen window, the backyard was moving into the early dark of late November, the pecan tree losing its definition against the sky. The kitchen light was too bright. The tap ran cold for 45 seconds. The third stair would announce whoever went up it next. Victoria looked at the kitchen, at the table and the stove and the window and the man and the child at the table, and she felt the words settle into her chest the way words do when they've finally found the right address. Home. Not performed, not managed, not the stage set version or the strategic version or the version you produced for a board of directors in a mahogany table room. Just this. Just the too bright light and the imperfect dinner and the creak of the stair and the way Sophie talked about a piñata like it was the most important thing that had ever happened, which at 7 it maybe was. She turned back to the counter and finished what she'd been doing, and the evening assembled itself around all of them the way evenings did. Dinner, homework, bath time, the argument about whether teeth brushing happened before or after the chapter. And when Sophie was finally asleep and the house was quiet, Victoria sat in the workshop with Liam for the last hour of the day. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to. The annulment papers were still in Christine's email draft folder. They would stay there indefinitely, and somewhere in the nightstand, folded on a hardware store receipt, 5 words sat in Liam Carter's handwriting. I don't want her to go. She wasn't going, and that was the whole story, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Even without the ending that was still being written, one imperfect ordinary day at a time. December arrived in Savannah the way it always did, not with the dramatic cold of places further north, but with a gradual softening of the heat, a lowering of the light, the particular quality of air that made the city feel more like itself somehow, as though summer was a performance it put on for visitors, and this was what it actually was when left alone. The workshop was colder in the mornings now. Liam had a space heater that he'd owned for years and trusted approximately 40%, and it ran in the corner of the workshop from first light onward, ticking and humming and producing enough warmth to make the space livable without ever fully committing to the task. Victoria had started wearing one of his flannel shirts over her own clothes when she sat on the shop stool in the mornings, a habit that had begun practically. She'd come out without a jacket one morning, and he'd handed it to her without comment, and had continued because the shirt was warm and because she had stopped somewhere in the last 2 months monitoring the image she projected inside this particular space. That was the thing about the workshop. You could only manage yourself in it for so long before the smell of the sawdust and the slow patience of the work wore the managing down. She'd watched it happen to herself over weeks and had stopped trying to prevent it. The Charleston Commission had started. Liam drove down twice a week, early, and was usually back by 3, so he could be home when Sophie got off the bus. He'd hired one person, a young man named Devante, who had been doing furniture repair out of his garage in Savannah for 2 years, and who had the particular quality of someone learning a craft seriously, which meant he made specific mistakes and corrected them specifically, which Liam said was the only kind of learning that stuck. Victoria had met Devante twice. He was 24 and careful with the tools, and had looked at Victoria with the particular awareness of someone who recognized her name from the news and was working out how to act normal about it. She'd shaken his hand and asked about the piece he was working on, and he'd answered about the piece, and after that they were fine. The expansion was small, deliberate, exactly what Liam had said he wanted. Not a brand, not a business in the formal sense, just the work getting larger in a way that didn't break what the work fundamentally was. She thought about that sometimes. The way he'd been so clear about it. I chose it. The small life, chosen, not defaulted into, not settled for, but genuinely selected. She had spent her career in spaces that were defined by scale. How large the collection, how significant the institution, how substantial the impact, and had absorbed, without meaning to, the assumption that larger was a direction you moved toward as a function of success. The workshop had been dismantling that assumption piece by piece for months, and she hadn't fully articulated what was replacing it until she found herself sitting across from the Foundation's development director in a meeting about a major acquisition grant and saying very calmly, "Bigger is not the objective. Better documented is the objective. Let's talk about what better looks like before we talk about how much." The development director had blinked. Victoria had not taken it back. She told Liam about it at dinner. He'd listened, and then he'd said, "What did she say?" "She said she'd need to rethink the proposal." "Is that good?" "It means she was building for scale instead of building for the actual work," Victoria said. "So yes, it's good. It's necessary." She paused. "I should have been saying that for 2 years." "You say things when you're ready to say them," Liam said. "That's generous." "It's true," he said. "You can't say something you don't understand yet." Sophie, from her end of the table, said, "What are you talking about?" "Work," Liam said. "Oh," Sophie said, with the tone of someone who found this only slightly less interesting than nothing. She went back to her food. The archive project had moved faster than Victoria had anticipated, which was the result of Dr. Adaeze Okonkwo being, as Victoria had always known but had underestimated in the abstract, formidable in the operational sense of the word. She had arrived in Savannah on a Tuesday in early December, a small woman in her late 60s who wore her white hair natural and moved through the Foundation's archive room with the focused attention of someone returning to a place they'd last left under circumstances they hadn't fully resolved. She'd known Samuel Hale's collection since she was a graduate student in the 1980s. She'd spent 30 years working adjacent to it, and when Ezra Hale had finally retired and the Foundation had shifted toward more public-facing preservation work, she'd retired too, because she said the archive was what she'd come for. And without Ezra to run interference, she wasn't sure the archive would remain the priority. She'd been right to worry. Victoria saw that now. Dr. Okonkwo spent 2 days in the archive room and produced, at the end of those 2 days, a 40-page assessment that was the most thorough and quietly devastating document Victoria had read in years. Not devastating in the sense of failure. The collection was intact, the documentation was largely sound. But devastating in the sense of how much remained undone. How much of Samuel Hale's original curatorial vision had been preserved in the objects without being extended in the scholarship. How many of the craftsmen's names he had recorded were still sitting in his private journals without having been formally integrated into the collection's public record. He wrote down everyone, Dr. Okonkwo said, sitting across from Victoria in the Foundation office on the second evening, the assessment between them on the desk. Every name, every piece he could attribute. He cross-referenced oral histories with ledgers with the physical evidence of the wood and the joinery. She touched the corner of the document. "We have all of it, and almost none of it has been published." "Why not?" Victoria said. "Because publishing it requires money and time and someone willing to make it the priority rather than the eventual goal." Dr. Okonkwo looked at her steadily. "Your grandfather made it the eventual goal. He was busy keeping the institution alive, which was its own work. And then you were busy keeping it out of your cousin's hands." She paused. "Now neither of those things is the urgent problem." "No," Victoria said. So, Victoria agreed. They worked out the structure of the project over the next 3 hours. The academic partnerships, the publication timeline, the digital archive component that would make the collection accessible to researchers who couldn't travel to Savannah, Dr. Okonkwo would consult formally. 2 junior scholars from the University of Georgia would be brought on as research fellows. The foundation would fund 3 years of dedicated archive work. When they were done, Dr. Okonkwo sat back and looked at Victoria with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a conversation and is now satisfied it has happened. Your grandfather would be pleased, she said. Victoria looked at the document on the desk. I hope so. He would also be insufferable about it, Dr. Okonkwo said. He would take credit for choosing you. He did choose me, Victoria said. Yes. He was also insufferable about that from approximately the moment you turned 12. A small, dry smile. He loved you very much, and he told everyone except you. Victoria looked at her. He told me, she said, in the letter. Good. Dr. Okonkwo stood, gathering her things with the efficiency of someone who had places to be and did not linger. He also told me something else once. He said the hardest part of building something meant to last was knowing when to stop building and start trusting it. She looked at Victoria directly. I think he was talking about the foundation. I think he was also talking about you. Victoria said nothing. Bring your husband to dinner while I'm in town, Dr. Okonkwo said, pulling on her coat. I want to meet the man who walked into a boardroom and talked about attribution rights in front of a room full of lawyers. How did you know about that? Christine Kwan is thorough in her reporting, Dr. Okonkwo said, and left. Victoria sat in her office for a long time after she left. The city was doing its early December thing outside the window. The amber light going earlier now, the squares holding their evening quiet. She thought about her grandfather, and the letter, and the word trust, and the way it applied to institutions, and to people, and to the specific act of letting a life grow into a shape you hadn't planned. She drove home. The house had lights on in the kitchen and the workshop, 2 warm rectangles in the early dark. She sat in the car for a moment, not because she needed to, but because she'd developed the habit of arriving slowly, of not running from the car to the door, of letting the transition from the foundation's world to this one be a conscious movement rather than a collapse. She went in. Dinner was already on the stove. Sophie was at the table with a book that was absorbing her completely. A chapter book, serious business, the kind where you had to be told twice to eat because the book was more immediate than hunger. Liam was in the kitchen moving between the stove and the counter with the easy efficiency of someone who had cooked in this kitchen every day for years. Dr. Okonkwo wants to have dinner with us while she's in town, Victoria said, setting her bag down. Good, Liam said. She already knows about the board hearing. Christine talks? Apparently. He stirred something. When? Thursday, if that works. Sophie has a thing Thursday afternoon, but she'll be done by 5:30. Sophie looked up from the book. What thing? Choir practice, Liam said. Oh, right. Sophie looked at Victoria. I'm in choir now. I know, I was there when you signed up. I'm not very good yet. You'll get better. Mrs. Patterson says I have enthusiasm, Sophie said, in the tone of someone reporting a compliment they are not entirely sure was a compliment. Victoria sat at the table. Enthusiasm is the foundation. Skill is built on top of it. Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to statements that sounded like they might be useful later. Okay, she said, and went back to the book. Victoria looked at the table, the wobbling corner. She reached under it and removed the cardstock shim and looked at it. The folded piece of a cereal box, soft and compressed now from months of use. And then she went to the junk drawer where she knew Liam kept, among many other things, a small collection of rubber furniture feet. She found one the right size, crouched down, pressed it under the corner of the table. She stood up and pressed down on the corner, solid. Liam was watching her. I know, she said. Took me long enough. 6 months, he said. I was building to it. He turned back to the stove, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was not saying anything on purpose. And she appreciated the restraint even as she recognized the precise texture of the amusement he was containing. She sat back down. The table was level. It had been fixable all along. The conversation about the wedding, the real one, not the courthouse, the one they'd been circling since November, happened on a Saturday morning in January when Sophie was at a birthday party and the house was quiet with the particular quality of a winter weekend, which was different from all other quiets, more expansive, less urgent. It wasn't a planned conversation. It arrived the way the important conversations in this house had tended to arrive, Not scheduled, not prepared for, but simply present one morning when the conditions were right. Victoria was at the kitchen table. Liam was at the counter. He'd been looking at something on his phone, she could tell from the posture, and he put it down and turned around and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The courthouse," he said. "In October. That was what it was." "Yes," she said. "I want to do it again," he said. "The right way. If you want that." She looked at him. "Define the right way," she said. He thought about it. "No cameras," he said. No lawyers, no statement released through Christine afterward. Just, he made a gesture that encompassed the kitchen and the workshop and the general direction of everything. Just what it actually is. Victoria looked at the table. Level, now, stable. "Here?" she said. "The workshop, maybe," he said. "Sophie thinks it should be the workshop." "You talked to Sophie about this." "She brought it up," he said. "She has opinions about most things." "She mentioned it to me too," Victoria said. "She said the workshop smells like history." "She said that?" "Last week. I think she was angling." Liam looked at the window. "Smart kid." "Your kid," Victoria said. "Our kid," he said, and it was so quiet and so simple that it sat in the kitchen for a moment before either of them moved, and Victoria felt the enormity of the two words without either of them making it enormous. She looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Okay, yes?" "Okay, the workshop," she said. "Okay, all of it." He nodded once, looked back at his phone. "I'll tell Sophie she was right. She'll be insufferable about it." "She's earned it," Victoria said. The wedding happened on a Saturday in late February, on a day when Savannah was doing its particular late winter thing. Not quite cold, not quite warm, the air with that specific early spring hesitation that felt like the weather hadn't decided yet and wasn't being rushed. The workshop had been cleaned, not staged, not decorated in the conventional sense, but cleaned the way a working space gets cleaned when it's being used for something that matters. The tools were in their places on the wall. The workbenches were clear. The pieces in progress had been moved to the side, though not hidden. A 19th century sideboard in mid-restoration, a stack of hand-cut molding that would eventually become something else, a lowboy that had arrived the previous week from an estate in Beaufort. The smell was what it always was. It had never not been right. There were string lights, that was Sophie's contribution, delivered with the firm authority of someone who had researched the matter. She had found them in the hardware store, and she had hung them herself with Liam's supervision, and they ran along the top of the tool wall and across the wide beam overhead. And in the low light of a February afternoon, they turned the workshop into something that was still itself, but also, unmistakably, more. The guest list was 22 people. Dr. Okonkwo, who arrived early and stood near the sideboard in mid-restoration with the expression of someone who had seen a great deal of history and found this particular instance worth the drive. Christine Kwan, who had driven up from Charleston and who had said, when Victoria called to invite her, that she'd been waiting for this invitation since approximately the third week of October and was glad it had arrived before she had to manufacture a reason to come to Savannah. Devonte, Liam's apprentice, who came with his girlfriend and stood near the workbench with the slightly overwhelmed quality of someone who kept calculating the net worth of the room and then deciding not to. Dara Flemons, the marine biologist from Sophie's school, who had become something Victoria could call a friend in the specific, ordinary way of people who stand next to each other in school, parking lots enough times, and gradually find that they've been honest with each other without planning to. 6 people from the foundation, including Patricia Mensah from the board, who had accepted the invitation with a warmth that suggested she'd been rooting for a specific outcome since the hearing. A handful of Liam's Savannah people, the small, deliberate circle he'd maintained, who greeted Victoria with the particular welcome of people who had known him long enough to know what the previous 3 years had cost him. And Sophie. Sophie wore a dress she had selected herself, pale green, slightly too formal for a February Saturday by normal standards, exactly right for Sophie's standards. And she stood near the front of the workshop for the entire ceremony, with the composed dignity of a child who understood that today was significant and had decided to be equal to it. The officiant was a woman named Reverend Clara, a retired civil rights attorney who had become a non-denominational officiant in her 70s because, she said, she liked the work. She was 81 and unhurried and said the words with the quality of someone who had said them enough times to know what they meant, and not yet said them enough times to have stopped meaning them. There were no vows written in advance. This had been a deliberate decision, arrived at on a Tuesday night 2 weeks before, when they'd been in the kitchen and Liam had said he didn't want to read something he'd written in a quiet moment and was now performing. And Victoria had said she'd been writing and discarding versions for 10 days, and none of them said what she actually wanted to say. And they'd agreed, somewhat to Christine's professional unease, to say it in the moment and trust that the moment would hold it. Liam went first. He was not a public speaker. He had established this at the board hearing, and it remained true. He looked at Victoria with the direct attentiveness he brought to things that required care, and he said, I don't know how to say big things. I've tried to figure that out over the last few weeks, and mostly what I keep coming back to is small things. You know where Sophie's class is in the school building. You know how I take my coffee. You know the rule joint is on the Pembroke table, and you know why I avoided it, and you called me on it anyway. He paused. I've been alive long enough to know that the small things are the actual structure. Everything else is just decoration. He looked at her. I'll give you the small things, for as long as you want them. Victoria looked at him. She had prepared nothing. She had, in the end, decided to trust the moment the way you trust a joint when it's been cut correctly. Not blindly, but because the preparation had been done and the material was sound, and sometimes you had to let the thing close and see if it held. I walked into your workshop because I was desperate, she said. I had a legal problem and a deadline and a strategy, and I thought I had anticipated every variable. She paused. I had not anticipated you, or Sophie, or the dinner table, or the workshop, or the 45-second tap, or the third stare that tells on everyone. She felt something in her voice that she let be there. I thought I knew what I was building toward my whole life. It turns out I was building toward a kitchen with an overhead light that's in the wrong position, and a table that wobbles, and a 7-year-old who asks the right question every time. She looked at him steadily. I don't want a different life. I want this one. I want it on purpose. The workshop was very quiet. Reverend Clara gave the final words the weight they needed. Liam and Victoria said what they were asked to say. The string lights held their warm light across the tool wall. When it was done, Sophie appeared immediately at Victoria's side with the targeted efficiency of someone who had been waiting for the procedural portion to conclude. She took Victoria's hand, the same matter-of-fact way she had the first time, after the board hearing, but longer now, not brief and releasing but just held. Victoria held it back. She heard Liam, nearby, talking to someone, Dr. Okonkwo, the low exchange of two people who had just met and were already, clearly, interested in each other's minds. She heard Christine laugh, which was rare enough to be notable. She heard Devante explaining the sideboard in mid-restoration to his girlfriend with a level of detail that suggested he'd absorbed more from Liam than either of them had probably tracked. She stood in the workshop with Sophie's hand in hers and looked at the room, the tools on the wall, the string lights, the 22 people who had been called here by the specific accumulation of decisions and accidents and stubborn, honest choices that had made up the last 4 months. And she felt the word again. Not like an arrival, like a confirmation of something already true. Home. The party lasted until 9. People ate, talked, moved through the workshop and the house in the natural way of guests, who are comfortable in a space, which meant most of them ended up in the kitchen at some point, because that is where people end up when they're comfortable. Sophie stayed up an hour past her bedtime and negotiated it successfully by being charming to the right people at the right times, which Victoria recognized as a skill Liam had never explicitly taught her, and which she had apparently developed independently. When the last car had pulled out of the gravel drive and the house had returned to its own company, Sophie fell asleep on the couch under a blanket before she could be moved to bed, which Liam said happened at parties, and was fine. He covered her more carefully and turned off the living room overhead and left the lamp. Victoria stood at the kitchen sink, the last of the glasses washed, looking out the window at the dark yard. The pecan tree was still bare. In a few weeks it would start to come back. Sophie had her branch picked out already. Liam came up beside her. They stood at the sink together for a moment, looking out at the dark yard, the way you stand somewhere you know well and look out at the night. The tap still runs cold for 45 seconds, he said. I know, she said. And the stare? I know. And the light in here is still... Liam. I'm just making sure you have current information, he said. She turned off the tap and dried her hands and turned to face him in the too-bright kitchen of the impractical house on the edge of Savannah. I have all the information, she said. I still chose it. He looked at her. And the expression she'd filed under open and unguarded, the one that cost him, that she'd seen only a handful of times before, was there, fully, without the usual brief appearance before the careful even one came back. It stayed. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. In the months that followed, the shape of their life settled into something that was not simple. It was never going to be simple. Two people with full and complicated separate histories did not produce simplicity when combined, but that had the specific quality of being genuinely inhabited. Victoria restructured the Foundation's senior team in March, which was not painless, and which required 3 difficult conversations and 1 separation that she'd known was coming and handled as well as these things could be handled, which meant she handled it directly, and without cruelty and lost sleep over it afterward, because that was what happened when you did hard things properly. She brought Dr. Okonkwo on as a formal senior advisor, which was Christine's idea, and which Christine framed as a governance upgrade, and which Victoria knew was also, partly, her trying to give Victoria someone in the room who had known Ezra Hale and could therefore provide the specific grounding that Victoria sometimes needed. The archive project published its first research output in April, a 60-page monograph on the furniture makers documented in Samuel Hale's journals, with full attribution, full documentation, and the kind of academic rigor that would hold up and compound and become the foundation for the next decade of work. Dr. Okonkwo wrote the introduction. Victoria wrote the foreword. She spent 2 weeks on 4 paragraphs and rewrote the last one 8 times and eventually called Liam into her office at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday and read him both versions of the last paragraph. He listened to the first one, then he listened to the second. Then he said, "The second one. You're actually in it." "I'm in the first one." "You're in the first one the way you're in a board meeting," he said. "You're in the second one the way you're in the workshop at 9 in the morning." She looked at the second version. "That's too personal for a foreword." "Why?" "Because—" She stopped, thought about it. Thought about her grandfather, who had been in everything he'd written. About Samuel Hale, who had spent 40 years making sure names didn't disappear. "Because I'm not used to it." "I know," Liam said. "Use the second one anyway." She used the second one. The response to the monograph was significant enough that Christine sent her a brief message that said only, "Your grandfather would be insufferable right now." Victoria read it and laughed, the real version, and forwarded it to Dr. Okonkwo, who replied with 3 words, "He really would." Liam expanded the Charleston Commission into a 12-month project and took on 2 additional commissions from the same estate network. He hired a second person in the summer, a woman named Rosa, who had been doing finish work at a commercial outfit in Atlanta and who wanted to do restoration specifically, who had sent Liam an email that he'd read aloud to Victoria because it was the kind of email that deserved to be read aloud. "I want to do work that matters to the piece, not just work that meets the deadline." He called her back the same day. Devante, by midsummer, could identify period joinery by sight and had cut his first successful ruled joint on a practice board, which Liam had dated and kept on a shelf in the workshop without comment. Victoria noticed it there one morning and asked about it. Liam told her. She looked at the practice board for a moment and then said, "You should tell him you kept it." "He knows I kept it," Liam said. "It's on the shelf." "He'll know you kept it. He won't know what it means unless you tell him." Liam looked at the shelf. Then he went out that afternoon and told Devante what it meant, which was that a correctly cut joint was the proof of understanding, not just practice, and that understanding was what the work was for. Devante had nodded with the particular seriousness of someone receiving something they'd wanted to hear said. Victoria heard about this at dinner because Liam told Sophie, and Sophie told it back with the amplified dramatic weight she applied to stories she found significant. And then Dad said, "I was there," Liam said. "I'm telling it," Sophie said. He conceded the floor. Sophie got her tortoise in June. This was preceded by 3 weeks of research that Victoria conducted with the genuine focus she brought to things she'd committed to, and by one conversation with a veterinarian friend of Dara Fleming's who confirmed that a well-maintained tortoise could live decades and required consistent care, but was, fundamentally, a reasonable pet for a household with a responsible adult present. Victoria reported this to Liam. Liam said, "You told her you'd research it." "I told her it would be my project," Victoria said. "I take my project seriously." The tortoise was a sulcata, 4 years old, acquired from a rescue organization in Augusta. Sophie named him immediately, Edmund, after Edmund Carr from the Foundation Board, which Sophie had decided was an honor because he had a face like someone who's seen a lot and isn't impressed but still shows up. Liam had looked at Victoria when Sophie said this, and Victoria had looked back at him, and the silent conversation they had in that moment lasted approximately 2 seconds and contained more than some people's entire relationship histories. Edmund the tortoise moved into the backyard with the slow, deliberate authority of someone who had been in worse situations and intended to make the best of this one. Sophie regarded him with the devoted attention she gave things she'd fought for. Victoria learned more about tortoise habitat in a single month than she had previously accumulated on the subject in 30 years of life, which was admittedly not a high bar. One evening in late summer, sitting on the back porch in the particular warmth that Savannah held even in the evenings of August, Victoria watched Sophie crouch near Edmund with a piece of leafy green held out in her patient, careful hand, explaining something to him in a low, serious voice. Liam was in the workshop. The light from inside the house came through the screen door in a warm rectangle. Somewhere down the block, someone was playing music. Indistinct, just rhythm. Victoria thought about a Tuesday afternoon in October 10 months ago. A black sedan on a gravel drive. A leather portfolio with papers she'd spent 2 weeks having polished. A woman who had planned for every variable and had been wrong about the most important one. She had walked into a workshop looking for a legal solution and found something she hadn't known she was missing because she hadn't known it existed, not for her, not as a practical reality, rather than an abstract concept. The kind of life that was actually happening, rather than the kind that looked correct. The kind where a tortoise ate leafy greens in the backyard, and the third stair announced you and the overhead light was in the wrong position, and you fixed the table eventually and left other things, and chose which battles to fight with the specific wisdom of someone who had learned, late and gratefully, the difference between what you managed and what you loved. She had not become a different person. She was still someone who wrote forewords 8 times and structured deals, and ran an institution and could name the governing law in 3 states' estate code without looking it up. She was still someone who processed things verbally, in long organized arguments that were occasionally monologues, and who checked her phone too often, and who had a persistent difficulty with the concept of not having a plan. But she was also now someone who sat on a back porch in August and watched a 7-year-old talk to a tortoise and felt the kind of peace that didn't require maintenance. That was the difference. Not transformation, expansion. Liam came out of the workshop at 8, wiping his hands on the shop rag, and sat in the other porch chair without preamble. Sophie looked up, informed him that Edmund had eaten almost all of the green, and went back to the conversation she'd been having with the tortoise. Liam looked at Victoria. She looked at him. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he said. "The console table is done." "The Charleston one?" "Yeah, it came out right." "Better than the Pembroke?" He considered this. "Different problem. Yeah, better." She nodded, looked back at the yard. "Liam." "Liam," she said. "Yeah. I think I want to write something about Samuel Hale," she said. "Not academic, not a foreword. Something longer, a real account, using the journals and the oral histories and the attribution records." She paused. "I don't know if I'm a writer." "You write 8 drafts of a 4-paragraph foreword," he said. "You're a writer." That's exactly what that is," he said. "You just do it with legal briefs usually." She looked at the pecan tree, beginning to thin now that summer was tipping toward fall. Sophie's branch was still there. Sophie had made it to the branch finally, in July, on the 4th attempt, and had sat in it for approximately 4 minutes before deciding she was satisfied and climbing back down. "Okay," Victoria said. "Okay, you'll do it?" "Okay, I'll try," she said. "There's a difference." "There is," he said. They sat on the back porch until Sophie declared that Edmund had gone to sleep, which she determined by criteria that were unclear but that she seemed confident about, and they went inside to the too-bright kitchen and the cold first tap and the table that no longer wobbled, and they had dinner, and Sophie talked about the first week of 2nd grade, which had been, in her assessment, so far okay, but with significant room for improvement, and Liam listened with the full attention he brought to everything Sophie said, and Victoria listened the same way, and the evening moved through them all the way evenings do when you stop trying to manage them and let them be what they are. Later, after Sophie was asleep, and the house had gone quiet, Victoria sat at the kitchen table with a blank document open on her laptop. She had typed and deleted a first line 3 times. She looked at the blank page. She thought about what Liam had said in the boardroom in October to a room full of lawyers and board members who had been waiting for strategy and gotten something else. The idea that there was a collection somewhere that kept both the work and the names. The thing that could not be undone once done. Not the selling, but the erasure. The names disappearing again. She thought about Samuel Hale walking 300 miles with no shoes toward a future he was constructing from nothing but conviction and the refusal to let history be revised into something more comfortable than true. She put her hands on the keyboard. She wrote a first line. She looked at it. She left it. The house was quiet around her. Liam's footstep overhead, the particular creak of the bedroom floor that she'd mapped, without meaning to, over 10 months of hearing it. The refrigerator. The tree frogs coming back now that the August heat was softening into the first edges of fall. Edmund, presumably, asleep in the yard in whatever manner tortoises slept. 3 toothbrushes in the bathroom. 2 adults and a child, navigating a life that had not been planned and had not been perfect and had not been anything other than real. The first line was still on the screen. She left it. She would come back to it tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and she would write it badly, and then less badly, and then one day she would read it back and it would be something true, because that was how true things got made. Not in one sitting, not from a place of certainty, but from the stubborn daily practice of showing up to the work and refusing to settle for the version that sounded right without being honest. She closed the laptop. She turned off the kitchen light, finally, after 10 months of it being too bright, and stood for a moment in the dark kitchen, in the house that had been a small life built by choice, and that had grown to include her without either of them fully deciding and without either of them regretting it. Then she went upstairs. The third stair announced her. She didn't mind. She never had.